Chains, thunder, and a whisper. The night fear met its match. Long before thunder shattered the sky, Elmridge chained its nightmares behind rusted iron. They called the nightmare Rocco, a once proud police dog now condemned to pacing circles in a prison of rumor and regret. But legends seldom stay quiet, and on the eve of the worst storm in years, an uninvited sound crept into the village. The tap-tap-tap of a cane on cobblestone, guided by the surest feet ever to tread without sight. Lena, blind since birth yet fearless in spirit, followed the scent of rain into the field where legends rusted. One crack of lightning revealed the impossible tableau, the monstrous shepherd quivering in terror at the sky, and the small girl reaching through the bars offering not safety, but understanding. From living room windows, townsfolk watched their nightmares collide with hope, wondering which would break first, the chain or the child's resolve. None guessed the storm itself would decide. There was a place in Elmridge where the air felt heavier, a patch of land at the village's northern edge where even the wind seemed to hush itself. It was there, behind a crooked line of warped fence posts and tangled ivy, that the villagers said the cursed one lived. His name was Rocco, though few dared say it aloud. Each morning, the children of Elmridge took the longer path to school, curving around the old timber barn and skirting far from the chained enclosure. Parents warned them without explanation, but the children knew. They'd seen the shape behind the rusted bars, heard the low, guttural growl that vibrated in the earth like an old wound reopening. The cage was crude iron poles once meant for cattle fencing, now bent into a cruel hexagon of confinement. Chains the size of a man's wrist coiled around thick posts, binding a single dog to the dark center of it all. A German shepherd, massive and scarred, with a stare like molten iron and teeth bared even at silence. Rocco. This morning, mist clung low to the fields, and the dew on the grass hadn't yet begun to glisten. The village was barely stirring when Leo, a wiry boy with dirt on his knees and a slingshot tucked in his belt, crept toward the edge of the field. He didn't come from fear like most. He came from boredom and the dangerous curiosity that festers in boys who grow up in places with too many ghosts and not enough truth. He crouched behind the blackberry bush, eyes narrowed, waiting for movement. Then, with a sudden jerk, he hurled a small stone toward the cage. Clang! The rock hit a rusted pole. A thunderous bark shattered the stillness. Rocco exploded from the shadows like a battering ram teeth flashing, saliva trailing, body surging to the limit of his chain with a metallic snap that rang like a warning bell through the morning fog. The ground shook beneath his paws. Leo screamed and stumbled backward, losing his footing in the wet grass. His heart pounded against his ribs like a fist on a locked door. From the porch of her home, Marta, the village elder, heard the sound. She didn't need to look. She knew it too well. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began her slow walk down the gravel path toward the boy. Leo had fallen on his rear, pants soaked, face pale. He almost was right there, he gasped, pointing toward the cage. But Rocco had already retreated, pacing behind the shadows like a ghost waiting for dark. Marta stood still beside Leo, her cane stabbing softly into the earth. Her voice was low, rasped by age and unspoken memory. "Don't tempt the devil, child," she said. "He's not a devil," Leo mumbled, though even he didn't believe it. Marta turned her clouded eyes toward the cage. "You don't know what he is, and that's the most dangerous kind." She helped the boy to his feet and whispered again, this time more to herself, "Stay away from the beast." But her words fell into the silence that Rocco left behind. That kind of silence always came after his growl, an aching, hollow quiet that lingered too long. The villagers didn't talk much about the dog anymore. They didn't need to. Fear had a way of becoming folklore, passed from one generation to the next, not through facts, but through the weight of avoidance. Rocco was no longer just a dog, he was a myth with breath. Some said he had demon blood in him. Others believed Jonas, the old hunter who raised him, had trained him to kill and then disappeared to avoid the consequences. A few whispered that Rocco had gone mad from solitude, and that one day the chains would break and he'd remember every face that ever passed him by. But no one really knew, and that was what made him dangerous. That night, Marta sat by her fire and stared at the flame with eyes that glimmered like old glass. She remembered the day Jonas had brought Rocco to tone a bold pup with ears too big for his head and a tail that wagged like it didn't know how to stop. Jonas had called him Rookie, hence the name. Rocco had once been playful, hungry to please, but things changed. They always did. She sipped her tea slowly, then whispered into the flames, "It's not the growl that haunts me. It's what came before it." Outside, in the cold cage of iron and memory, Rocco lay down slowly. His breath came hardened paw twitching from an old wound that flared when the temperature dropped. His eyes scanned the trees. He heard the boys rock again, over and over, in the back of his mind. He didn't hate them. Not really. But the chain tugged at his neck like a memory he couldn't chew through. And the darkness? It had become his only friend. Tomorrow, they'd avoid him again. They always did. But somewhere beyond the fog and fear, something was shifting. A truck would soon arrive. And with it, a girl who couldn't see him, but would be the first soul to truly look at him. They say the forest swallowed him whole. No footprints, no farewell, no body. Just the howling wind through pine and the low trembling growl of the dog who returned without him. His name was Jonas Halberd, a man both feared and forgotten long before he vanished. To some, he was a ghost in his own lifetime, a recluse who hunted the mountains beyond Elmridge like they belonged to him. His cabin sat deeper than most dared to go, past the rock face where moss never dried, and where the air always carried a trace of something metallic. He had no family, no friends, just a dog, and what a dog he was. Rocco had been Jonas's shadow, carved from muscle and discipline, bred for sharpness and silence. He obeyed without command, tracked without fail, and stood at Jonas's side like an extension of his will. Together, they disappeared into the woods for days, sometimes weeks, and when they returned, Jonas's truck carried trophies, elk antlers, wild boar tusks, fox pelts. The villagers never asked questions. They didn't want to know what else Jonas hunted out there, until the day he didn't come back. It was autumn, the kind of autumn that paints trees with fire and coats breath with frost. Jonas was seen one last time at the edge of town, loading his truck with canned beans and 2 boxes of rifle rounds. Rocco sat in the passenger seat, tail curled, eyes alert. As they drove off, Elder Marta watched them disappear into the dust and muttered, "One day, the woods will keep what they've earned." 3 days passed, then 5. On the 7th day, Rocco came back. He wasn't in the truck. He wasn't led by a leash. He just appeared, limping, alone. His fur matted with blood that wasn't just his. A gash along his shoulder exposed raw flesh. His collar was torn. One of his paws dragged behind him like it didn't belong to his body anymore. The village froze. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just walked to the center of town, eyes vacant, body swaying. And when a man reached out just to check the wound, Rocco lunged. Teeth flashed, flesh tore. Screams echoed off cobblestone. A woman tried to intervene. She, too, was bitten. After that, the village changed. They found the truck 3 miles from Jonas's cabin, its tires slashed as if by claws or blade. Inside, the driver's seat was smeared with dried blood, a rifle missing from its rack. But Jonas's body was never recovered. His cabin, when found, looked like someone had left in a hurry or been dragged away. The firewood was stacked, but cold. A stew sat rotting on the hearth. And Rocco? He refused to leave. He returned each day to the edge of town, pacing, growling, searching. Some believed he had turned wild, lost his mind from whatever he'd witnessed. Others whispered darker theories that he'd killed Jonas himself, snapped after years of brutal training. Or worse, that Jonas had used him for things no one wanted to admit. Whatever the truth, the decision came quickly. They built the cage within 3 days, took 12 men, iron rods from the scrapyard, chains from the sawmill. And even then, 3 men walked away bloodied. Rocco fought them like he knew what they were building wasn't a home, it was a tomb. Since then, no one got near. Some left meat at the edge of the bars. Others crossed the street to avoid even the shadow of his enclosure. Children weren't allowed within 50 yards. And the story of the dog who returned alone was sewn into bedtime warnings. Only Marta, old and half forgotten herself, still remembered how it began. She remembered the first time she saw Jonas slap the pup across the muzzle for a mistake that wasn't his. Remembered the way Rocco flinched and still obeyed. Remembered the long winter nights when distant howls echoed through the woods and were answered by something deeper, more broken. No one ever asked what Jonas did to that dog in the silence of the trees. And by the time they did, it was too late. Rocco now lived in the space between myth and memory. Some still claimed to hear him howl when the wind passed a certain way. Others said his eyes glowed red in the dark. But the truth, if there was one, remained locked behind the bars. Every morning he stood at the same corner of the cage, like he was waiting for someone to come back. Every night he lay curled up facing the woods, as if guarding a secret only he had survived. And in the quiet hours just before dawn, when mist touched the earth like a whisper, you could almost hear him whimper, not from pain, but from something deeper, like grief, or guilt, or both. The truck arrived without a sound, as if the fog had rolled it in. It was an old blue Datsun, faded, dented, humming softly like it had seen too many winters, but still remembered how to carry a family forward. Its tires crunched over the gravel path that ran through the heart of Elmridge, scattering birds and drawing curious eyes from behind window curtains. 3 figures stepped out. A man with tired shoulders and hands that looked like they had once held tools too long. A woman with kind eyes and a scarf knotted carefully around her neck. And a child, small, quiet, dressed in a pale lilac coat, and holding a worn canvas satchel close to her chest. Her name was Lena. She was 10 years old and blind since birth. She didn't look at the village because she couldn't. But she faced it, head tilted slightly, listening. Not just to the chirp of the birds or the creak of shutters swinging in the breeze, but to the hush that fell as they passed. That silence wasn't the usual kind. It wasn't the peace of morning. It was watchfulness. The kind bred by stories told too often and understood too well. "She's blind," someone murmured from behind a wooden fence. "They're moving into the old Thatcher place," said another voice, hushed but pointed. "God help them. They don't even know." Indeed, they didn't. The Thatcher cottage sat on the very edge of the village, nestled beneath a copse of fir trees and surrounded by a crumbling stone wall. Its paint had long since surrendered to moss, and its porch steps groaned under weight like they'd rather stay forgotten. But it had a certain gentleness to it, a kind of tired charm, like a worn-out book no one had finished but still refused to throw away. And just 20 yards beyond the back fence was Rocco's cage. The family didn't know. No one had told them. The realtors never mentioned the dog. The villagers wouldn't dare bring him up as if his name, once spoken, might summon his growl through the fog. Lena's father, Caleb, unloaded boxes from the truck bed while her mother, Nadia, guided the girl toward the porch with a hand gently resting between her shoulders. "We'll need curtains," Nadia whispered as they stepped inside. "And some warmth on the walls, but it's got good bones." "Like an old soul," Lena said softly, her fingers brushing the doorframe. Nadia smiled, though her eyes fluttered surprised. Lena's voice was delicate but unafraid, always laced with quiet observation. She had a way of making people pause, not because she demanded space, but because she somehow filled it with stillness. Outside, an old man on a bicycle passed slowly. He didn't wave, just tipped his hat and looked at the truck as if measuring its intentions. At the corner grocery, Elder Marta stood in the doorway like a sentry. She sipped her tea without blinking. "They've got a child," someone said beside her. "And not just any child," Marta replied, "the kind who listens more than she speaks." The day wore on. Boxes were carried in. A kettle hissed. The front gate squeaked open and closed with the rhythm of new beginnings. But Lena didn't rush to explore. She sat instead on the front steps, legs crossed, listening. And then she heard it, a sound not like the others. Low, rough, wounded, not far but not near either. Grr, bark. It cut through the birdsong like a splinter, deep and raw and primal. For a moment, even the leaves seemed to stop moving. Lena's head turned instantly toward it. "What was that?" she asked. Her mother froze in the doorway. "Just a dog," she said too quickly. "Probably one of the farm strays." But Lena didn't nod. She just tilted her head again, listening deeper. Her hands rested on her knees, but her fingers tapped an invisible rhythm, as if her body was reading something beneath the silence. "That didn't sound wild," she murmured. "It sounded tired." That night, over dinner, Lena sat quietly, while her parents chatted about curtain rods and insulation. She barely touched her soup. Her mind stayed on the sound. That single bark had told her more than any villager ever would. It wasn't angry. It wasn't hungry. It was alone. In the fields behind the house, beyond the tall grass and through a line of worn cedar posts, Rocco watched. He had smelled them before he heard them. New people always had a different scent full of hope and things they hadn't lost yet. But this one, this child, she was different. She hadn't flinched when he barked. She didn't turn away. She listened. That night, as stars pressed like whispers against the ceiling of clouds, Lena stood by her window, hand pressed against the cool pane. "I don't know who you are," she whispered toward the dark, "but I heard you." From the cage, across the stretch of moonlit field, Rocco lay still. His ears twitched, and for the first time in years, he didn't growl. The morning light in Elmridge didn't so much arrive as it tiptoed in. It spilled quietly over the rooftops, filtered through dusty windows, and stretched long fingers across the creaking wooden floor of the cottage at the village's edge. Inside, Lena sat cross-legged on a fraying rug, her fingertips grazing the grain of the floorboards as if reading a story only she could feel. She was humming softly, no tune in particular, just the kind of melody that children invent when the world is still waking up. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes gently closed, and she was listening to the gentle flutter of curtains, to the distant clatter of someone chopping wood, to the kettle in the kitchen letting out a sleepy sigh of steam. And then she heard it, bark, low, abrasive, echoed by silence. She froze. It wasn't the yapping of a farm dog chasing shadows. It wasn't the bark of greeting or the bark of play. This one was something else entirely. Raw, deep, like it had to claw its way out of the chest it came from. There was weight in it, history, and something that sat quietly underneath the sound, like a shadow behind a curtained sorrow. Lena's brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning her head toward the kitchen. Her mother, Nadia, was at the stove stirring oats, the wooden spoon tapping against the pot with a rhythm learned through routine. She paused, listening. Another bark cracked through the air, closer now. Then another, shorter, this time more growl than bark. Then silence. Nadia tensed. She wiped her hands on a cloth and walked to the window, peeking through the side where the curtain didn't quite cover the view of the back fields. The cage was still there. So was the dog. His silhouette stalked the edge of the enclosure, fur raised, tail stiff, pacing like a storm held back by rusted iron and memory. "That's just the dog that lives behind us," Nadia said gently, trying to disguise the tremble in her voice. "He barks sometimes. Nothing to worry about." But Lena wasn't convinced. She rose to her feet slowly, walking barefoot across the floor toward the door, her fingers brushing the doorframe. "He doesn't sound angry," she whispered. "He sounds sad." Prison. Her mother turned sharply. "That dog is dangerous, Lena," Nadia said more firmly now. "He's not like others. People have been hurt. You mustn't go near him." Lena didn't argue. She rarely did, but her face didn't retreat in fear. Instead, she tilted her head again, trying to memorize the shape of the bark in the air, its weight, its rhythm, the breath that followed after, like a sigh left unfinished. "There's something in his voice," she said softly, "like someone calling from far away, but not expecting anyone to answer." Nadia blinked, taken aback by the words not because they were poetic, but because they were true. She didn't reply, just walked over to her daughter and knelt in front of her, gently cupping her face. "You have a good heart, sweet one," she said. "But not everyone, not everything is meant to be saved." Lena reached up and placed a hand over her mother's hand. "I'm not trying to save him," she said. "I just want to know why he's crying so loud inside." The words hung in the room like dust in a shaft of morning light. Outside, the village went about its quiet rituals. But behind the Thatcher cottage, beyond the line of tired cedar posts, Rocco stood at the far end of his cage, ears perked. He had barked only because the wind shifted, carrying a scent he hadn't smelled in years, one that lingered like a memory half recalled. Lavender. And cinnamon soap. The kind Jonas's wife used to wear before she left, long before Rocco's world became iron and isolation. But this was different. This scent was younger, softer, untouched by pain. It wasn't Jonas. It wasn't rage. It was something unafraid. He paced again, growling low, but there was no force behind it, just habit. In the cottage, Lena moved to the porch and stood in the light. She didn't call, didn't whistle. She just stood there, hands clasped behind her back, head turned slightly toward the sound, toward him. And then she smiled. Faint, quiet, but full. "I hear you," she whispered. Rocco couldn't understand the words, but he felt them. For the first time in years, the cage didn't feel like punishment, just distance. The bakery in Elmridge was the kind of place where time forgot to hurry. Every morning, the scent of warm rye and buttered loaves floated down the cobbled lane like an unspoken invitation. People didn't just come for bread, they came for stories. And on this morning, the village's stories lingered heavier than usual. Inside, the wood-burning oven crackled quietly. Sunlight poured through the front windows, catching dust motes in mid-air like golden snowflakes. Elder Marta sat at her usual spot, a corner booth beneath the oil lamp with her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders and a chipped porcelain cup of chamomile between her hands. She watched the door. And soon enough, it opened. Lena stepped inside, one hand trailing the wall, the other gripping the soft fabric of her coat. Nadia followed close behind, placing a gentle palm on her daughter's back as they made their way to the counter. "We'll have 2 bowls of the lentil," Nadia said, offering a small smile to the baker's wife, whose apron was dusted with flour. "And a slice of the honey bread, please," Lena added softly, surprising them both. The woman behind the counter blinked. "Of course, dear." They took their seats by the window, where the light fell warm across Lena's face. She turned her head slowly, taking in the voices, the clatter of plates, the steady rise and fall of small talk. Her senses moved through the room like fingers across braille, reading mood instead of words. The soup came steaming in thick clay bowls, and they ate in silence for a moment. Then Lena spoke. "Mom," she said quietly, "who's the dog behind our house?" Nadia paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Around them, the atmosphere shifted subtly at first. A chair scraped slower than it should have. A man's cough stalled mid-breath. A nearby couple exchanged glances over their mugs. Nadia lowered her spoon. "He's just an old guard dog," she said. "Best not to think much about him." "But he doesn't bark like a guard dog," Lena murmured. "He barks like he's remembering something painful." Across the room, Elder Marta stirred in her seat, her eyes locking on the girl with unexpected focus. "You've heard him, child?" she asked, her voice like gravel wrapped in linen. Lena turned her face toward the sound. "Yes, more than once." Marta set her cup down with a soft clink. "Then do yourself a kindness," the old woman said, "and forget it." Nadia sighed gently. "We've already spoken about this." But Lena interrupted. "Why is everyone afraid of him?" A silence settled so thick you could taste it in the bread. The baker's wife cleared her throat. "That dog ain't right. Never was." "He's possessed," Marta muttered. Nadia looked over, startled. "Marta." "I'm old, not blind," the elder snapped. "I remember what I saw. That beast came back from the woods, bloodied and snarling after his master vanished. You know that." Lena frowned. "Maybe he was scared." "Scared dogs don't tear flesh," another voice added from a nearby table. It belonged to a man with sun-cracked skin and a scar running down the side of his neck. "He bit 2 people, unprovoked. Tried to drag a child once, too, if it weren't for the chain." "He's not chained anymore," Lena said softly. "He's caged." The room stilled again. Nadia placed her hand over Lena's on the table, as if trying to anchor her to the present. "Sweetheart, it's not our concern." But Lena didn't withdraw. She felt it in her chest like a wire pulled tight between her and something unseen. The dog's pain had a frequency, and she could hear it in the spaces no one else listened to. "He's not evil," Lena said, almost to herself. "He's grieving." Marta let out a breath that might have been a scoff or a sigh. "You're 10, child. You don't know grief." Lena turned her head slightly. "Neither do you. If you think grief always comes with tears." That silenced even Marta. The soup cooled. The honey bread sat untouched. And yet, Lena's words remained warm on the air, unsettling in their clarity. She didn't try to argue, didn't raise her voice. She simply knew. Outside the bakery, A cold breeze stirred fallen leaves across the cobblestones. Across the village, crows gathered along the rooftop of the old Thatcher house, their cries sharp against the sky. And behind it, in the cage overgrown with weeds and rusted bolts, Rocco lay curled but restless, his ears twitching as if someone had just said his name without speaking. The night in Elmridge had a way of folding in on itself. Once the lanterns dimmed and the last kettle cooled, silence claimed the village like a soft, invisible fog. Trees stopped rustling. Steps grew muffled on damp earth. And in the stillness, the world belonged to things that didn't need light to feel their way forward. Lena sat cross-legged on the front porch, wrapped in her faded blanket, her bare feet brushing the wooden planks. The house behind her was dark, save for the soft flicker of candlelight escaping from the living room window. Her parents had gone to bed an hour ago, assuming she had too. But she hadn't. She couldn't. There was something in the air that wouldn't let her sleep, a vibration beneath the quiet, as though the night itself were holding its breath. Her head tilted toward the distance, toward the field where moonlight met shadow. And that's when she heard it again. Grrr. Not a full bark, not even a snarl. Just a low, grating hum that scraped against the base of her ribs like a bow over taut strings. Another growl. Longer this time, and then nothing. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was pain. Lena leaned forward slightly, her fingers curling into the blanket as she strained to follow the sound's trail as if she could catch it mid-air and press it against her ear. There, a whimper. It was barely audible, the kind of sound you'd miss if you weren't listening for it, but Lena was. She heard the way it trembled at the edges, like a voice learning how to cry again. It wasn't threatening. It was mourning. She didn't know why that realization made her throat tighten. Maybe it was because she'd heard it before, not from dogs, but from people. From a woman in a hospital bed who used to hum lullabies before forgetting the words. From her father, when he thought she was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with hands pressed into his eyes. From herself, once in the dark, when she first realized what blind would mean for the rest of her life. Pain had many voices, but sorrow only whispered. Lena pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and turned her face fully toward the sound. And then in the hush that followed, she spoke. "I don't know your name," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the chirp of a cricket. "But I think you're hurting." The wind shifted gently, brushing her cheek like a sigh. "I heard you the other day, when you barked. Everyone else ran from it. But I think you were just trying to be heard. She paused, her fingertips gently tracing the grain of the porch wood like braille. "They said you were dangerous," she added, "that you hurt people. But no one asked why." Behind the house, at the edge of the trees, a shape stirred. Rocco stood in the far corner of the cage, still as stone, his ears trained toward the porch. His breath came slow but uneven, his weight shifting from paw to paw. He couldn't see her clearly. The girl was just a voice in the dark. But there was something in it that made the fur on his back lie flat again. She wasn't afraid. Not of him. Not of the dark. Not of his story. And that was new. "I know what it's like," Lena whispered. "To have people think you're broken before they know you. To be judged by something you didn't choose." She tilted her face skyward, blind eyes closed, lashes brushing her cheeks. "My world doesn't have colors," she said, "but it has sounds. And I hear things people miss, like how your growl. It ends like a sob you swallowed." Another pause. "I think you're tired," she added, "and lonely, and maybe you miss someone." She didn't expect a response. She didn't need one. Talking into the night had always brought her peace, even if no one answered. But this time, as she let the words fade into the air, something shifted behind the trees. A soft shuffle of paws. A breath, released slow and long, like the kind that follows a bad dream. In the cage, Rocco had crept closer to the bars, his body low, muscles taut. He didn't growl, he didn't bark, he just listened. And for reasons even he didn't understand, he stayed. Lena placed a hand on her chest, as if steadying a compass that pointed towards something unseen. "I'll talk to you again tomorrow," she said. Then she stood, blanket trailing behind her like wings too tired to lift. As she walked back inside and shut the door with a soft click, Rocco stayed in place, eyes fixed on the spot where the girl had been. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to patrol, or bark, or remind the world he was still dangerous. He just existed, under the stars, with the echo of her voice, soft, steady, and true, still lingering like a thread between two lonely souls who hadn't quite met. Yet, the sky was still a shade of charcoal. When Lena slipped out the front door, she moved like a shadow, barefoot, the porch board sighing under her light step. Her blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, frayed at the ends, and damp with the breath of dawn. The air tasted of dew and cold soil. And somewhere in the trees, a lone owl called out to no one. The world hadn't woken yet, but she had, and so had he. Grrr! The sound sliced through the silence like flint across stone low, warning, primal. Lena paused, one hand brushing the wooden railing as she tilted her head. There it was again, that voice in the dark. His voice. Rocco. He was awake too, waiting. She stepped down into the grass, letting her toes sink into the cold. Her fingers extended, touching the edges of the stone wall that framed their garden, then followed the path where fence posts became guides, each one worn smooth by wind and time. Lena moved slowly but with purpose, her feet knowing the rhythm, her ears tuned to the heartbeat of the earth. She could feel him before she heard him again, like a pressure in her ribs, a tension in the air that made her breathing slow. A few yards ahead, behind thick bars and rusted bolts, Rocco watched her come. From the cage, his form was still shadow hulking, waiting. His breath came heavy, nostrils flaring as her scent reached him through the damp. A different scent. No fear, no urgency. Just intention. And that's what scared him. He growled louder now, a guttural, rising thunder that echoed across the quiet field. Birds startled from branches. A goat bleated from a nearby pen. The village, barely stirring in sleep, shifted into awareness. A shutter creaked open. A voice, sharp and panicked, rang out from a farmhouse window. "Hey, Girlden, go near there!" Another light flicked on. "Someone stop her. That's the halberd dog. He'll tear her apart." Lena didn't stop. She walked with one hand tracing the fence, the other held slightly out as if balancing on sound itself. Her head turned toward the growl, not away from it. Behind her, the voices rose. "God in heaven, she's blind!" "Where are her parents?" A door slammed. Footsteps pounded across gravel. But no one ran into the field. No one dared get close. The cage stood like a scar in the center of the clearing, black iron welded into a shape that spoke only of fear. And inside it, Rocco surged forward. Chains snapped tight. Dirt kicked up beneath his paws. His teeth flashed like broken glass under moonlight. And still, she walked. Lena stopped just a few feet from the bars. She didn't cry, didn't tremble. Her chest rose and fell calmly, the way it always did when she was listening. She turned her face toward him. "I heard you again last night," she said, her voice so soft the wind almost stole it. "You sounded cold." Rocco snarled. The sound ripped through the clearing. It was instinct, defense, habit. But beneath it, just beneath, was hesitation. He had expected retreat, panic, screams. Instead, he got her. She took one slow step forward, then another. "Don't!" someone shouted from the tree line. "She'll lose her hand," a woman cried. But Lena's hand didn't flinch. She raised it gently, palm facing out, fingers relaxed. "I'm not here to hurt you," she whispered. Rocco bared his teeth. Saliva dripped from his mouth. His tail stiffened. He backed away, then lunged again. Clank! The chain snapped taut, keeping him inches from the bars. But she didn't move, not even a flinch, just that hand, still outstretched, still believing. "I don't know what they did to you," she said, "but I don't think you deserved it." The cage pulsed with his breath. Her voice was barely above the breeze now. "I think you were loved once, and then someone left. Or got taken." "Oh." Rocco stopped growling. He didn't move, he just stared, the way soldiers stare at graves. The clearing fell into silence again, broken only by the ragged sound of his breath. Lena stepped closer, toes touching the cold bars. She couldn't see the fury in his posture. She couldn't see the way his body coiled with distrust, but she could feel it. And somehow, She wasn't afraid. She took one final step and knelt down slowly in the grass. They were just a few feet apart now, one behind iron, the other behind skin. "You don't have to talk," she said. "You've been shouting your story for years and no one listened. But I'm here now." Behind her, the villagers stood frozen, their fears wrapped tight around their mouths, unable to speak what their eyes refused to believe. A blind girl had crossed the field, faced the beast, raised a hand, and he hadn't struck. Not yet. Not at all. The wind stopped. It was that kind of silence, thick and swollen like the pause between lightning and thunder, where every living thing forgets how to breathe. Rocco's muscles coiled, his claws digging into the dirt beneath the cage as he launched forward with terrifying force. The chain snapped with a clang, metal stretching to its limit. His body crashed against the iron bars, jaws wide, teeth bared pure fury distilled into one heartbeat. Lena didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply knelt in the grass, her face turned toward the chaos, and extended her small hand through the bar steady, trembling, open. "I'm not here to hurt you," she whispered again, as if repeating it might shift the weight of the world. For a fraction of a second, Rocco's body hovered in that violent suspension, fur bristled, eyes wild, breath steaming in the cold morning air. One more lunge, and her wrist would snap like a twig. But he didn't bite. He didn't move. He just stopped the way a storm sometimes dies before it hits land. And then, a breath. Low, long, trembling. Rocco's snarl faded into a deep, throaty growl. His ears twitched, his nostrils flared. He smelled her. Not fear, not sweat, not adrenaline, but something quieter, something human. Her fingers were still outstretched, palm up, like an invitation in the dark. They were shaking now, barely perceptible, but to him, it was everything. A message written in the language of prey, and yet she wasn't prey. She wasn't running. That alone confused him. He stepped forward. One slow paw, then another. Chains clinked behind him like haunted bells, but he moved with surgical control, eyes locked on her hand. His head lower, a deer's flat, tail frozen, and in that ancient predator's body. Something else stirred. Curiosity. The girl tilted her head. "I knew you weren't mean," she said, her voice smaller now. "Just hurt." He was close enough to touch her now, close enough to crush her fingers. Instead, he sniffed them, first tentatively, then deeper. His warm breath rolled across her wrist like fog off a lake. She could feel every exhale hot, sharp, alive. She didn't pull back. She didn't even gasp. And that's when the world around them began to stir again. A woman's breath caught in her throat. Old Marta dropped the loaf of bread she'd been clutching. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else cursed under it. From behind a fence, a boy no older than Lena gasped, "He's not biting her." He sounded like he'd seen the moon touch Earth, because that's what it felt like, a miracle. Not loud or grand, but quiet, impossible, and true. Rocco's nose touched her palm. Lena bit her lower lip, holding her breath. The fur on his muzzle was coarse and uneven, matted from years of neglect. His scars were hidden beneath the black saddle of his coat, but she didn't need to see them to know they were there. She could feel them in the way he moved, like something that used to be proud, now caged within its own rage. And yet that snout lingered. She whispered, "You're not a monster. You just forgot." Rocco exhaled low and deep, the sound almost like a sigh. Then something changed. His shoulders dropped slightly. His eyes narrowed into knife softened, just enough to reveal the creature behind them. Not a beast, not a killer, just tired. Lena slowly withdrew her hand, brushing her fingertips gently along the bars. "I'm Lena," she said softly. "You don't have to tell me your name. I'll wait until you're ready." He didn't respond, but neither did he growl. The tension that had held the clearing in a vice finally loosened. The villagers, still paralyzed in disbelief, began to whisper among themselves like waves brushing the edge of an abandoned dock. "I saw it with my own eyes. She touched him. No, it's a trick. That girl's cursed. She's blind. She felt him." Old Marta clutched her shawl tighter, her voice cracking. "That dog's got the devil in him. You mark my word, she's just waiting." But Lena wasn't listening anymore. She stood slowly, her knees damp from the grass. She wiped them absently, as if it were any other morning, any other stray dog, any other act of small kindness. Then, just before turning back toward the path, she whispered, "Thank you for not hurting me." Behind her, Rocco didn't move, but his head tilted ever so slightly, as if trying to memorize the shape of her voice. Lena traced the fence again with her hand, walking back the same way she'd come. Her mother stood waiting at the porch, pale as snow, hands shaking. "Lena!" she cried. "Are you Diddy?" Lena simply smiled. He listened. Her mother sank to her knees, gathering her daughter into trembling arms. Her lips pressed against Lena's hair, and her tears soaked into the girl's blanket. "You could have been killed," she whispered. "But I wasn't," Lena replied gently. "Because he didn't want to." And in the cage behind them, Rocco sat down. For the first time in years, he didn't pace. He just sat and watched. The bell above the bakery hadn't even rung when the shouting began. By the time the sun cleared the ridgeline, the whole village had erupted like a pot too long over fire. Smoke from morning ovens curled above rooftops, mixing with the haze of suspicion that spread like a stain. She touched the beast. Someone gasped in the market square. Not just touch-stroked its muzzle, another barked. No bite marks, no scratches. "It's not natural." By mid-morning, every wooden bench outside the chapel was lined with hunched backs and hushed voices. Men shook their heads. Women crossed themselves. Children were pulled back indoors with a firmness that bordered on panic. The door to the general store slammed open. Mrs. Talbot, widow, mother of 3, and self-appointed guardian of village proprietor marched out in a flurry of apron strings. "I warned them not to rent that cottage," she muttered, eyes blazing. "There's a reason it stayed empty for 5 winters. Someone followed close behind. "You think the dog's cursed her? She's blind, isn't she?" Another voice added from the corner. "Maybe she sees things we don't. Maybe the dog felt it." Old Marta, seated like a rotting root in her usual spot beneath the elm tree, didn't speak for a long time, just rocked slightly, muttering half-formed prayers into her shawl. Then finally, with eyes like pale smoke, she said, "That dog is marked, and now so is she." The words were like oil on fire. Up at the cottage, near the edge of the forest, Lena sat at the kitchen table, swinging her feet softly beneath her chair. The wooden floor was warm from morning sun, and the scent of honeyed porridge filled the room. Her mother, arms still shaking from the earlier ordeal, ladled soup into 2 bowls but said nothing. Lena's father paced near the window, watching figures gather down the hill, voices rising with the wind. "Should we leave?" he asked finally, not turning around. "If they blame her if they think she's—" "No," his wife said firmly. "We didn't do anything wrong. She's a child, Miriam, a blind child. And they're acting like she summoned the devil himself." The spoon clinked against the side of the bowl. Lena reached forward carefully and found her mother's hand. "He let me touch him." Her voice was soft, not triumphant, not frightened, just honest. Her mother froze. Lena tilted her head slightly. "He was angry, but also lonely. I could feel it." The room was quiet for a long time. Then her mother exhaled, slowly, and pulled Lena into her arms. She didn't ask why. She didn't say the villagers were wrong. She just held her daughter tighter than she had in days. Outside, the crowd had grown. In front of the church, Father Hugo raised his palms to calm the gathered voices. "We don't know what happened yet," he said gently, "but we mustn't turn on a child." And so, she entered the beast's cage, a voice shouted back. "You think that was an accident?" She walked right up to him, another added. "Didn't even flinch." "I saw it too," muttered the butcher, his apron still stained from morning work. "She spoke to it, like it was human." "It's not human! It killed Jonas!" "Shh, quiet now." But the fire was lit. A woman near the back of the crowd clutched her daughter's hand and hissed, "You are not to speak to that girl, you hear me?" Not a word. I didn't do anything wrong," the child whispered, eyes glassy. "She was just being kind. Kindness gets you torn to pieces." Back in his cage, Rocco lay flat on his belly, eyes flicking toward the tree line. The village still hummed behind him, fear radiating like heat, but it no longer reached him. He hadn't moved since Lena left. Her scent still lingered, the soft tremble in her hand, the words that didn't command or plead, but offered. "I'm not here to hurt you. He'd heard those words before, long ago, from someone else. But they hadn't sounded like that. He sniffed the dirt, growled low, not in anger, but in something else, something like longing. In his chest, the unfamiliar flutter of memory stirred. That night, as the cottage lights dimmed and the hush of evening settled over the village like a blanket stretched too thin, Lena sat on the porch, knees hugged to her chest. From far off, Rocco gave a single bark, sharp, then quiet. Her mother stepped out with a shawl, draping it over Lena's shoulders. "Come inside, love. It's cold." Lena leaned her cheek against her knees. "They're afraid of me." "No," her mother whispered. "They're afraid of what they don't understand." Lena hesitated, then asked, "Was it wrong, what I did?" Her mother knelt beside her, brushing hair from her face. "Sometimes the right thing makes people uncomfortable. That doesn't make it wrong." "Oh." Down the slope, inside the cage, Rocco lifted his head. The wind shifted, and something, just the faintest thing, changed. The morning came with a pale hush, the kind that draped the village in dew and made even the roosters hesitate before calling. But one soul was already awake. Rocco. He stood inside his cage long before the first rays of sun slipped between pine trunks. His breath clouded the cold air in short, uneven puffs. Not the harsh panting of aggression, something else. A tremble that ran beneath his ribs like the echo of a memory not yet formed. He didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't charge the bars the way he used to every morning, when birds were fools and villagers were trespassers. Instead, he waited, ears alert, tail low, muscles twitching beneath coarse fur still matted from years of neglect. Every few moments, he paced, not with the frenzied circles of a caged predator, but with restless uncertainty. Back and forth, nose pressed to the gate, then to the patch of grass where her scent still clung. He stopped suddenly, sniffed, his ears twitched, still no sign of her. His chest tightened with something unfamiliar. Disappointment? Number. That was too human a word. But it felt close. Up at the cottage, Lena stirred beneath her blanket. The morning chill had crept in through the cracks in the window, but she didn't mind. She liked the way the cold made the sounds clearer. Her fingers moved across the worn wood of the bed frame, until they found the scarf still faintly tinged with the earthy scent of last night's wind. She smiled. Then, as if drawn by a string no one else could see, she rose. She didn't speak, didn't ask permission. She just stepped outside barefoot, as she often did, and let the morning guide her. Rocco's head snapped up at the soft crunch of leaves. His body tensed, but only for a breath. Then it relaxed, just slightly, as the shape came closer. Small, deliberate, blind. Her. She walked slowly, hand grazing the fence posts, humming softly under her breath. A tune without words, the kind that wasn't sung for anyone but the wind. He lowered his stance, tail still tucked, but no longer rigid. She stopped a few feet from the cage. "Morning," she said gently, tilting her head in that way that made it feel like she saw more than anyone else. Rocco didn't move, didn't lunge, didn't growl. She sat down cross-legged on the damp ground, close enough that he could smell the bread on her breath and the damp wool of her sweater. He crept forward one step, then another. The metal of the cage didn't groan. The air didn't buzz with threat. Just the silence between them. It stretched and softened. "I thought about you last night," she whispered. "Your breathing. It changed after I left. Like you didn't want to be alone again." He blinked. Slow. A pause too long to be instinct. She smiled faintly. "I didn't want to be alone either." And then she did something that startled even him. She began to hum. Not loud, not clear. Just enough for the melody to float like mist between them. It wasn't a song he knew, but something about it stilled the shaking in his legs. He sat, not in submission, in curiosity. Up on the hill, unseen behind the laundry lines and low stone walls, two pairs of eyes watched. "Is she singing to him?" one of the boys whispered. "Don't get closer," the other hissed. "He'll tear you up. He's not even barking." The silence that followed was more unnerving than any growl. Children weren't supposed to see monsters be gentle. It messed with the rules adults gave them. Lena traced her finger across the dirt. "They say you're dangerous," she said. "But I don't think you are." Rocco tilted his head. She nodded, as if she heard him. "I think you're hurt." "That's different." He exhaled sharply. Not a snort, not a warning. Almost like agreement. The melody faded. They sat like that for a long time, girl and beast. Prisoner and seer in a silence richer than any story the village had ever told. Then, slowly, Rocco lowered himself fully onto the ground, chest pressed to earth, head between paws, not asleep, just with her, present. And Lena? She leaned slightly forward, hands resting on her lap, face tilted toward the bars. "If you want," she whispered, "I can come back tomorrow." The only answer was the soft thud of his tail brushing against dirt once, then twice. A sound no one in the village had heard from him in years. Not even once. Milo wasn't supposed to be awake. The morning bell hadn't rung yet, and his father's warning still echoed from the night before. "Stay away from the beast. That blind girl's lucky he didn't snap her in two." But curiosity doesn't care much for warnings, especially when you're 9, light on your feet, and have a slingshot stuffed in your back pocket for courage. Milo crept through the tall grass at the edge of the woods, dirt soft beneath his soles. The wind carried the sharp scent of pine and something else older, heavier, metal and fur, the kind of scent that clung to nightmares. He crouched behind a half-fallen log, just beyond the hill's bend, where the cage sat in its usual gloom like an old secret no one wanted to claim. But what he saw made him forget to breathe. There she was, that blind girl with the clouded eyes and quiet voice. And the dog was lying down, not watching her, not snarling, just there, head resting on the earth, only inches from where her hand absently brushed the grass. Milo's brow furrowed. He blinked hard, as if that might correct the scene. But it didn't change. The dog Rocco shifted only once, not toward the girl, but toward the faint melody she hummed again. The one that sounded like a lullaby, half remembered in a dream. By noon, Milo had told 2 others, and by sundown there were 6. None of them told their parents. They just whispered to each other beneath the bridge, trading speculations like smuggled candy. He didn't even growl. Maybe she controls him with some kind of magic. No, she just talks to him. I think he listens. You're making that up. I saw it. The next morning, 3 boys and a girl named Elsie followed Milo up the ridge just before breakfast. They ducked behind the low blackberry thickets that lined the far slope close enough to glimpse the old cage, but far enough not to be noticed. Rocco was already there. So was Lena. She sat cross-legged, humming quietly as she snapped twigs in her hand, feeling their texture like braille. Rocco didn't lie down today. He sat tall, ears forward, not aggressive, just alert, like a soldier beside a campfire. He stared at the girl's hands as they moved, one moment twitching, the next still. "She can't even see," Elsie whispered. "So how does she know where he is?" "She doesn't need to see," Milo said, strangely serious. "She knows." None of them understood what that meant, but none of them left. From her spot near the cage, Lena paused, mid-song. She tilted her head just slightly toward the bushes. "Are those your friends?" she asked gently, not smiling, not teasing. Rocco lifted his head, sniffed the air once, then went still again. Lena didn't turn toward the rustling. She didn't need to. "I think they're afraid of you," she said softly, as if it were a private thought. "But not because of you, because of what people told them." Rocco shifted his weight, a faint grunt leaving his throat. It wasn't irritation. It was resignation. "They don't see you," Lena murmured, brushing her fingers across the dirt. "Not really." A pause, then, "But I do." Behind the thicket, Milo felt something stir in his chest, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Guilt. He had thrown stones at that cage once, just last spring. He'd shouted at it like the others, laughed when Rocco snapped, told stories about blood and bones. But this didn't match any of it. The beast didn't look like a monster. He looked like a prisoner, listening to music. Only one person remembered how to play. By the end of the week, there were 9 children who watched. No one spoke above a whisper. No one dared throw anything. Even the rowdy twins, Lucas and Jonah, who once boasted of stealing bones from the edge of the cage, sat still in the bushes, eyes wide and silent. And every day, Lena came. And every day, Rocco waited. What the children didn't know, what the adults hadn't noticed yet, was that something had begun to change in the soil of the village. Not a sound, not a movement, a shift. The kind that begins with questions. The kind that starts when old eyes are forced to see something new. The sky wore a colorless hush that afternoon, none of those strange, in-between hours where the sun softened but refused to set. Cicadas buzzed like a distant choir, and dust swirled idly in the golden light. Lena walked slowly down the slope, her cane tapping the earth with a rhythm only she knew. She didn't need it to find the path anymore. Her feet had memorized the dips and roots. Each step toward the cage felt less like trespassing now, and more like returning. Rocco was already there, as always. Paws curled beneath him, gaze steady. He no longer barked when he heard her coming, no longer stiffened, but he never moved first. Today was no different at first. Lena stopped just a few feet from the bars, sitting cross-legged like she always did. Her fingers sought the familiar pebbles near the cage's edge, tracing their edges as if braille could grow from the ground. "You're quiet today," she said gently, angling her face toward him. Rocco didn't respond. His breath rose and fell in slow, practiced cadence, watching. "I had a strange dream last night," Lena continued. "There was a river, and you were in it. You were swimming, not chasing anything, just floating." She smiled faintly, though her eyes, pale and misted, looked beyond everything. "You looked happy." A small sound escaped Rocco's throat, something between a grunt and a sigh. Lena tilted her head. "I wonder," she whispered, "if anyone ever let you be happy before." Time passed the way it always did between them. Unmeasured, slow, honest. The wind tugged gently at Lena's braid. She reached forward, palm resting just beyond the line where Rocco usually stopped. An offering, not a request. He stared at it. That familiar blindfolded hand. So still, so patient. Then barely a breath's width he leaned in, sniffed once, twice, and then he did something neither the earth nor the sky had witnessed in years. He wagged his tail, just once, slow, tentative, like a memory stirred awake by accident. Lena didn't gasp, didn't flinch. She only smiled, small and soft and full of something sacred. "You remember how?" she said. A silence followed, not empty, not awkward, the kind of silence filled with meaning too fragile for words. Rocco blinked slowly, as if unsure what his body had just done. His tail stilled again, but it didn't tuck, it didn't retreat. It simply lay beside him, no longer braced for war. Lena reached up, brushing a curl from her cheek. "It's like your heart forgot the rhythm," she murmured. "But it's still there. Hiding, maybe. But still beating." Rocco shifted his weight slightly, the sound of paw on dirt, impossibly gentle. Lena turned her face toward him again. "I don't need to see you to know what's happening," she said. "Your silence. It's softer now." Behind the thicket, unseen by the girl but very much present, 3 children watched in spellbound awe. They had seen the wag. Not imagined it, not whispered it, seen it. Milo leaned forward, mouth ajar. "Did you see that?" he whispered. He wagged. Elsie breathed. For a moment, they didn't feel like children hiding behind bushes. They felt like witnesses to a miracle too shy to happen under adult eyes. In the village square that evening, rumors swirled like wood smoke. Some said the dog had been bewitched. Others claimed the girl had healing hands. But Lena didn't speak of it to anyone, not even her mother, who had begun to look at her daughter with both pride and a fear she couldn't voice. That night, before sleep, Lena pressed her hands together beneath the blankets and whispered into the dark, "Thank you." She didn't know if Rocco heard, but miles away, across the field, and beneath a fading moon, the dog who hadn't wagged his tail in 7 winters dreamed of water. And the sound of a girl's voice. The storm came without warning. Not a drizzle, not a gentle hum. A sudden rip across the sky, lightning arcing jagged like broken veins, followed by a thunderclap so fierce it rattled the windows of every cottage in the village. Inside the little house at the edge of the woods, Lena paused mid-step. Her hands tightened around the teacup she was carrying, the liquid sloshing just beneath the rim. She tilted her head, that sense of something wrong, alive, trembling in the air, like a thread about to snap. Then it came. The barking. Feral. Raw. Each bark like a wound ripped open. From the cage beyond the field, Rocco's voice tore through the thunder louder than any wind, more guttural than any fear. It wasn't the sound of anger. It was panic, the kind that breaks bones from the inside. Lena set the cup down on the windowsill, slowly, gently, as if to balance the world. Then she walked outside. Rain hadn't fallen yet, but the wind had changed. It reeked of electricity and old grief. Trees bent like they remembered. Her father, Daniel, stood at the door, calling out, "Lena, wait! Come back inside!" But she kept walking barefoot, her nightgown brushing the grass, her steps steady as her hair flew around her face. She reached the porch, placed both hands on the railing, and tilted her head toward the storm. She didn't need to see to understand. Rocco was breaking. Each bark was more unhinged than the last. She could hear the scrape of claws against wood, the metal clang as he slammed himself against the bars. Rocco, the silent shadow for weeks now, had unraveled. And she knew why. It wasn't just thunder. It was memory. Lena closed her eyes and whispered, "You're not there anymore." Her voice was soft, but it carried. "You're not in the fire. You're not in the trucks. You're not in the screaming place." The wind howled back. Rocco barked louder, and for a moment it seemed the cage would tear from its hinges. Villagers watched from cracked doors and curtained windows, muttering prayers and fears and curses they didn't understand. Lena stayed still. She gripped the railing and called again, firmer this time. "Rocco." The barking paused, only for a breath, but it paused. Then another roll of thunder cracked the sky like bones breaking. Rocco howled. Daniel stepped forward now, his face pale and drawn. He watched his daughter so small, so fragile, facing something even grown men dared not approach. He had never seen her like this. Rooted. Steady. A still point in a storm. He started to say her name again, but something in him stopped him. Not fear, reverence. Instead, he stood there in the doorway, arms crossed, helpless, watching the invisible thread between a girl and a beast shake but not break. "I know it hurts," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "I know the sky sounds like the thing that hurt you." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. "I don't know what they did to you, but you're not there now. You're here, with me." She took a shaky breath. "And I'm not afraid of your voice." The next flash of lightning painted the world in white, and in that frozen second, Daniel saw it, through the sheet of rain now beginning to fall. Through the gray, Rocco had stopped. He wasn't barking. He wasn't lunging. He was pressed against the front of the cage, head low, chest heaving, eyes locked in Lena's direction like a soldier who heard a voice in the fog. Rain soaked the girl's braid, slid down her jaw. But she smiled. A tiny, broken, whole smile. Minutes passed. The storm raged on. But Rocco didn't bark again. He lay down still panting, but no longer fighting shadows, no longer trapped in that other place. And Lena? She stayed on the porch, humming, barely audible. A lullaby her mother used to sing when she was little and the world had teeth. Her father came beside her now, not to take her in, just to be near. He placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. "You calmed him," he said quietly. "No," she whispered. "He calmed himself. I just reminded him he could." The storm had not passed. It lingered, as some storms do not out of anger, but as if the sky itself couldn't decide whether to hold on or let go. Rain began to fall in earnest. Cold, steady, a cleansing kind of downpour that soaked the world in silence. Lena didn't move from the porch steps. Her arms were tucked around her knees, her dress clinging to her like memory. And though the chill set into her bones, she leaned forward, just enough for her voice to carry again. Not words this time. A melody. Soft. Uneven. As if she wasn't singing to anyone, but with something an old hum braided from her mother's voice, her own heartbeat, and the rhythm of the falling rain. Across the yard, behind the crooked wire gate, Rocco didn't bark. He didn't growl. For the first time in days, maybe, weeks, she listened. Lightning flickered. A harsh blue-white slap across the dark. It lit up the cage like a scene from some war-torn place, and for a breath, the world held its breath. There he was, the dog everyone feared, the beast that no one touched, lying down, not fully, not trustingly. But something in his body had shifted. His head rested on his paws, and though his ears twitched with every distant rumble, he didn't rise. He stayed low, breathing hard, still trembling, but not running from ghosts this time. He was staying. Lena pressed her hand to the porch rail, her voice quieter now, just barely above the rain. "I'm here," she whispered between notes. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a command, it was a truth. The downpour grew heavier. Water pooled in the dirt, carving paths through the dried mud around the cage. Grime began to loosen, clumps slid away from the base, and along Rocco's flanks, the rain did what no hand had done in years. It touched him, not in fear, not in violence, but in cleansing. At first, it looked like streaks of darker fur, but as the lightning cracked again, and the girl saw through the veil of water, she realized they were something else. Scars, faint but deep, ribbons of pain carved long ago, some straight, some jagged. One ran along his ribs, barely healed right, curving like a question that had never been answered. Lena's breath caught, not in pity, but in knowing. She leaned closer, gripping the wooden post beside her to steady her body against the tremble that rose not from cold, but from understanding. "They did that to you," she said. Her voice was barely a sound. "Didn't they?" Rocco didn't move, didn't blink, but his ears flicked again, just once. Acknowledgement. Or memory. Rain ran off the edge of the porch like tears too long held back, and Lena began to sing again. Not a lullaby this time, but something older. A tune with no words, just rise and fall. A song that said, "I see you, and I'm not looking away." She closed her eyes. Let the storm rage. Let the past shake loose. Let scars be seen. Inside the house, her father watched through the window. His hand gripped the curtain, knuckles white. He saw the girl, the cage, the way the dog didn't lunge, didn't threaten, and he saw something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in for a long time. That maybe broken things weren't meant to be feared. Maybe they were meant to be understood. When the next bolt cracked the sky, Rocco didn't flinch. He exhaled, a slow, audible release, heavy as history. And then, so gently it could have been a mistake, he lowered his chin fully to the ground, his body softening like someone who finally found a patch of dry earth in a flooded world. Lena didn't cheer, didn't move, but her eyes brimmed, and for the first time, she whispered something not to the storm, but to the dog, to the scars, to the part of him that remembered everything and yet chose for this one moment not to run. "You're still here," she said. "Even after all of it, you're still here." It wasn't the rain that brought him outside. It was the silence. Dr. Bernard Castell, known simply as Doc Bernie to the villager Shad, lived in the weather-beaten cottage near the olive grove since before most of them were born. Time had folded his shoulders, thinned his voice, but not his eyes. Those, Lena's mother used to say, still held stories no one dared ask about. He hadn't touched a scalpel in 10 years, hadn't stitched a wound, hadn't leaned over a trembling body whispering, "You're going to be okay. Stay with me." But habits die slower than people, and the storm tugged at him like an old call to duty. From behind his cracked window pane, he watched the girl in the rain. Her dress soaked, her hair stuck to her cheeks like ivy clinging to brick. She was sitting by that cage again, and that dog was lying down, in the open, breathing steady, not snarling, not baring teeth, just being. Doc Bernie squinted, stepped onto the porch, ignoring the protest of his aching knees. The sky pulsed with lightning, and for one brief instant, the world stood still long enough for him to see. The fur around the dog's flank wet, matted head parted just enough. Scars, crisscrossed like branches, not the kind dogs get in alley fights, not the wild, desperate lashes of a creature defending territory. These were different, long, measured. He'd seen that pattern before. In field tents during the war, in soldiers who couldn't speak, in animals pulled from places no one wanted to name. He muttered it before he could stop himself. Those scars, they're not from fights. The wind carried his voice off the porch and into the dark like it knew where to deliver the weight of those words. A young boy standing under a fig tree nearby, a child too curious for his own good, tilted his head. "What kind of scars, Dr. Burney?" The old man didn't answer at first. He just stared. At the girl. At the dog. At the space between them that used to be filled with snarling and now was just rain. He turned to the boy and said quietly, "One's no creature should carry." The boy ran off, words already bubbling in his throat, like a secret too heavy for one child to hold. By evening, the whisper had spread. Not shouted like the usual gossip in the village, no. This one traveled softer. Through glances, through pauses at the market stalls, through the way someone would start to say, "That beast," and then stop. At the bakery, Marta's hand trembled as she wrapped a loaf for the widow Levine. "You heard what Bernie said?" she asked under her breath. The widow nodded. "He's seen war. If he says those aren't fight scars, he's not the type to imagine things," Marta finished, eyes darting toward the window, where the rain still kissed the cobblestones. That night, Bernard sat alone at his kitchen table, tea untouched, the steam having long given up. He traced the rim of the mug with one finger. His mind wandered, not just to the dog, but to the girl, to the stillness in her posture, to the kind of courage that doesn't raise its voice but sits quietly beside something broken until it dares to breathe again. He whispered into the room like a man confessing to ghosts. "Someone made that dog afraid of thunder. Someone taught him pain. The mug rattled as his hand shook, not from cold, but from memory. Outside, the rain eased, and though no bell rang, something sacred had already begun. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. Understanding. The first quiet note of a truth that had long been buried, and now, maybe, would start to surface. The morning broke quiet, not with the restless wind or rooster calls, but with the kind of hush that makes even leaves hesitate. Lena stood near the cage, a patch of bread tucked in her pocket and a soft rhythm in her breath. Rocco was already awake, he always was, but he didn't bark anymore. He watched her with those wary amber eyes that had once only known threat and survival. This morning, though, there was no growl. Just breath. Just distance. Just the fragile trust that had grown, unwatered by fear. Lena didn't reach for the latch. She didn't even kneel. She stood still, feet planted in dirt, and spoke. "Rocco," she said gently, like she was remembering his name for him. "I'm going to try something." Her hand stayed by her side. She didn't gesture, didn't coax, didn't command. Just let the space between them fill with the tremor of her voice. "Can you sit?" she asked, not sharply, not firmly, like a suggestion to the wind. Rocco tilted his head, didn't move, didn't blink. She smiled not because she expected him to obey, but because he hadn't flinched. The second day, she tried again. Same voice, same breath. "Sit, Rocco." This time, he lowered his haunches not all the way, not like a trained dog would, but a bend, a beginning. She didn't praise him with claps or treats. She simply said, soft as moss, "Thank you." His ears flicked, a signal only he could read. By the fourth day, she could say it once, "Sit," and he would settle into the earth like he belonged there. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't sharp, but it wasn't fear, it was understanding. Villagers had started to linger near fences again, not shouting, not scolding, just watching. One child whispered, "She doesn't touch him." Another answered, "She doesn't have to." Lena's father had noticed too. One evening, he leaned on the porch railing, arms crossed, eyes narrowed like he was trying to read something far away. "She's not training that dog," he muttered. Her mother glanced up from shelling beans. "No?" He shook his head slowly. "She's talking to him." Ewu. Lena kept her rhythm, never rushing, never raising her tone. She didn't treat Rocco like a problem to solve. She treated him like someone who had been spoken over too long. One morning, when she arrived, she said nothing at all. She just looked at him. Rocco looked back. Then without a sound he sat. And for the first time, She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She crouched nearby, careful not to cross the invisible line between them. "Do you remember who you were before they made you afraid?" she whispered. Rocco blinked slowly, and for just a moment, his tail made one slow thump in the dirt. In the bakery, Marta folded her arms tightly. "He's still dangerous," she insisted to the widow, but her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. In the shadows of the orchard, the retired vet said to no one in particular, "I've seen trained dogs. This one, he's not responding to orders. He's responding to her." Oh. The village didn't know what to do with that. With a dog who didn't bark at thunder anymore. With a girl who taught with no leash, no rope, no treat. Just tone. Just presence. Just grace. And somewhere, in the long stretch of that summer morning, a dog who had forgotten how to be safe remembered how to be still. It was still early when Lena walked down the path again barefoot, as always, hair still damp from the morning wash, the hem of her nightdress trailing dew. But this time, she carried something in her arms. Not food, not rope, just a blanket. Old, faded, frayed at the edges. It had once been her baby blanket hand, stitched by her grandmother, worn thin by years of clinging, crying, dreaming. It still smelled faintly of lavender, of sleep and lullabies and quiet things that could never hurt you. And now, she brought it to him. Rocco didn't bark. He'd stopped doing that a while ago. But he rose when he saw her slowly, with the stiffness of a body that had once known chains and cold floors. His eyes darted to the blanket, then to her, then back. Lena didn't speak. She knelt not too close and unfolded it beside the cage. Not inside, just near enough. "It's not much," she finally said, brushing a bit of dirt off the corner. "But it smells like home. My home." She didn't know why she said it aloud. Maybe because words were like bridges, and silence could still be heavy between them. Rocco crept closer, one paw at a time. He sniffed the fabric nose twitching, breath hitching like memory rising from some forgotten cavern in his chest. He didn't growl, didn't flinch, didn't tear. Instead, he chirkled. Once, twice. Then, slowly, he sank onto this body, curling over the fabric like it might disappear if he didn't keep it safe. Lena didn't move. She just watched. And something in her heart cracked not from pain, but from the unbearable gentleness of it. Like watching a soldier finally take off his armor. Rocco rested his head on the blanket. His eyes fluttered. He didn't sleep, but he didn't guard either. He simply was. And for a dog who had once been only muscle and reaction, being still was a miracle all its own. From behind the fence, a rustling. The vet again, half in shadow, half in thought. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "He guards it," the old man muttered. "Not like prey, like he's been entrusted." By midday, 3 children had crept up the hill near the orchard, pretending to chase dragonflies just to sneak a glimpse of Rocco and the girl. They saw her cross her legs, her back resting on a tree trunk just outside the cage. They saw the blanket crumpled under Rocco's side. They saw his tail not wagging, not tucked but still. And in the stillness, a kind of reverence. "He didn't bite it?" a child asked in disbelief. "No," another whispered. "He didn't even paw at it." Word spread, as words always did in towns with more wind than news. Some called it foolish, some called it dangerous, but none could deny what they saw. A war-weathered dog, guarding a child's blanket like it was something sacred. That evening, Lena returned again. Rocco lifted his head as she approached. No sound, just breath. She crouched near the cage. Her fingers brushed the grass, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Then softly, "Thank you for not tearing it." Rocco blinked, then laid his head back down, on the blanket. Later, at dinner, her father broke the silence. "Did he really?" Lena nodded. "I think he knew it was mine," she said. Her voice wasn't proud. It wasn't hopeful. It was sure. He didn't understand it. But he didn't challenge it either, because sometimes belief doesn't begin in the mind. It begins in what you see that cannot be explained. From then on, the blanket stayed. Rocco wouldn't let the rain reach it, wouldn't let the wind take it. He didn't need to be told. He knew it was a gift, and somehow it was also a promise. Morning came softer that day. The sky, washed in pale honey light, seemed to hush the world into stillness. The village, still wary, still watching, had begun to shift not in trust, but in curiosity. And children, as they always do, felt it first. They came in pairs at first, pretending not to look, chasing wind-blown petals down the path, playing tag just far enough from the cage to run if needed, but not far enough to miss what they were truly here for. Rocco, and the girl who no longer feared him. He was lying there, chin on the faded blanket, golden eyes following the flutter of leaves not in alarm, but in rhythm. He didn't bark, didn't rise, didn't warn, only blinked, slowly, as if saying, "I see you. I don't mind." Lena was already sitting near him, legs folded beneath her, tracing lines in the dirt with a twig, humming. She noticed the smallest one first. A boy, no older than 5, standing half behind his sister's skirt, big eyes, small hands, clutching a feather he'd found on the walkover. He stepped closer, then froze. Rocco watched him. The boy looked at Lena. She smiled, not the big kind adults do when they try too hard. Just a soft one, a knowing one. "His name's Rocco," she said, without rising. The boy didn't speak. He looked at the cage, then at the blanket, then at the great paws resting just behind the rusted bars. And somehow his little voice, unsure, rose like a question. "Does he bite?" Lena shook her head. "Not when you're gentle. He knows the difference." She patted the grass beside her. "You can sit here if you want." The sister hesitated, but then she nudged him forward. Feet shuffled. A whisper of a giggle. Another child came, then another, until 4 of them sat beside her, knees knocking, faces bright with half fear, half awe. Lena didn't push. She simply waited. Time, she'd learned, was like water. If you stayed long enough, it carved even stone. After a while, Rocco shifted. He stretched one paw, just one forward, the claws clicking softly against the bottom of the cage. A tiny movement. But to the children, it was everything. They gasped. The boy dropped his feather. Lena leaned in. Her voice became a thread of breath. "You can touch," she said to him. "But just his paw, gently, like you're saying hello with your fingers." The boy nodded. Not quite brave, not quite scared either. He reached out. And there it was, small fingers brushing fur that was coarse, warm, alive. Rocco didn't move, didn't flinch. He allowed it. The boy looked up, eyes wide. "He's soft." Lena grinned. "Told you." The other children leaned in, one by one, taking turns as if approaching a sleeping mountain. By the 3rd child, something miraculous happened. Rocco's tail barely, but surely thumped. Once. Then again. The children gasped, then laughed. Light, bubbling laughter that spilled across the field like the first bird song after a storm. Their joy wasn't loud. It was tender, as if they all knew instinctively not to break the moment. Behind the fence, a few adults had gathered some with arms folded, others with faces half-turned in disbelief. One woman whispered, "Is that the same dog?" No one answered, because no one quite knew. For the first time, the name Rocco became something more than a warning. It became a secret, a wonder, a story beginning to rewrite itself. Later, when the children ran off to lunch, to chores, to pretend nothing happened, Lena remained. She didn't say much, just sat beside the cage, watching Rocco watch the sky. She whispered softly, more to herself than to him. "You let them laugh." And Rocco, still and steady, let his tail thump once more. It wasn't a command he followed. It wasn't training. It was trust, born not in orders but in moments like this. Moments wrapped in small hands and giggles and the hush of something broken beginning to heal. Night had a different sound that evening. It wasn't the usual hush of crickets or the occasional bark from a distant farm. It was something heavier, a pause between gusts, a tightness in the air, as though the wind itself had forgotten how to breathe. The first one to notice was old Mr. Harrow, the trapper who lived alone near the northern edge of the woods. His cabin was built from stone and memory, both stubborn things. That night, he heard the snapping. Not twigs, not branches, logs. Thick ones. cracked under weight that didn't belong to deer or fox. He stepped onto his porch, shotgun resting against his hip, and scanned the dark timberline. At first, nothing. Then, a movement lumbering, slow. A silhouette just past the fence line, broad-shouldered, muffled by snowfall that hadn't yet reached the village but whispered of its coming. The bear, a wild one. Not local, not right. Drawn down too early from higher ground pushed by storms, perhaps hunger. Its coat matted, get uneven, but its eyes gleamed, hungry, not afraid of light, not afraid of sound, just moving. Toward. By morning, the rumors had sprinted faster than any feet. A bear in the woods. Big, too close. And someone said the trapper had found claw marks on the edge of the community, fencing deep enough to gouge through bark and wood. 3 gashes, as long as a man's forearm. That afternoon, the church bell rang out not for prayer, for warning. Doors were bolted, windows latched. Parents hushed their children before the word bear could turn into bedtime terror. Even the bravest dogs didn't bark that day. They just paced near thresholds, tails stiff, ears cocked. Something in the earth had shifted. Even without seeing, they felt it. At Lena's house, her mother pulled thick curtains closed. She lit the oil lamp early, though the sun had not yet set. "Stay inside tonight," she said to her daughter, gently but without room for questions. Lena, Kiet, nodded, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, toward the yard, toward the cage, toward Rocco. He had been unsettled since nightfall. Not wild, not aggressive, just alert. Still as stone, head raised, chest low to the ground. His body a taut bowstring, eyes fixed on a point far beyond the trees. He didn't growl, but his breathing had changed. Shallow. Controlled. Lena came to the porch as dusk poured over the hills like smoke. She sat cross-legged, her back against the door, and whispered, "You feel it too, don't you?" Rocco didn't look at her, didn't blink, didn't need to. Elsewhere, elders gathered behind closed shutters. "Could be rabid," one murmured. "Or worse, desperate." The trapper spoke low. "It's not a local bear. This one came down early. Could be chased by wolves. Could be starving. Snow's pushing them down the mountain too soon." One woman crossed herself. Another gripped her shawl like a shield. The fence won't hold if it wants in. And outside, somewhere beyond the safety of hearth and hinge, the trees swayed slow and rhythmic, like they were holding their breath. The scent of early winter carried on the wind. Sharp pine, frozen dirt, and something else. The musk of wildness returned, uninvited. That night, Rocco didn't sleep. Neither did Lena. She lay in bed, fully clothed, eyes on the ceiling. She heard it too, a distant rustling. Maybe the groan of something heavy against wood. Maybe just her heart. Then, silence. Even the owls had gone quiet. She sat up, crossed the floor barefoot, pulled back the curtain. Rocco was still awake, still watching, but his stance had changed. He was standing now, head lowered, body angled slightly toward the fence beyond the field. And then she saw it. Just for a moment. A shimmer. Not eyes. Not quite. But movement. Beyond the trees, she pressed a hand to the glass. Rocco's ears pricked. And for the first time in weeks, he let out a sound, not bark, not growl. A warning. Low. Guttural. As if to say, it's closer than they think. It started with the rain. Not the angry, slashing kind, but the soft percussion of nature tapping gently on rooftops and leaves. A lullaby for some. A whisper for others. For Lena, it was a call. She had always loved the sound of Ithau. It made the world hush. How it made even the earth seem like it was listening. And so, against her mother's soft warnings, and behind her father's distracted back, she slipped through the kitchen door barefoot, her coat too thin, her thoughts elsewhere. Rocco had not barked once that morning. He was pacing again, cage to gate, gate to edge, head raised, tail still. His eyes hadn't left the northern tree line for hours. But Lena heard the rain. And nothing else. She stepped lightly through the wet grass, its tips brushing against her calves, her small feet sinking softly into the earth that had turned to sponge. Her hand outstretched, catching the drops like little miracles. Just past the barn, the field opened wide, endless, framed by the edge of the forest like a breath held too long. The clouds overhead churned in grays and silvers, like ink dropped in water, but she didn't look up. She was humming, the same song she'd once sung to Rocco in the storm. The notes stumbled from her lips now, slow and uneven, but sweet. She didn't see the branches shift, didn't hear the snap of moss under weight not meant for this lowland, didn't feel the air shift predator heavy. But Rocco did. Back at the house, her mother was drying herbs by the stove, humming a second behind the thunder. Her father was tightening the barn shutters, glancing toward the sky as if it owed him answers. It was the silence that broke first. That kind of silence you feel in your bones before your ears catch up. A vacuum. Then screams, sharp, frantic. Lena! The trapper had seen it first from his porch through broken binoculars. A blur of movement. Brown, towering, lumbering from the tree line like an avalanche with eyes. The bear. It had followed the scent of warmth, of food, of movement. And there, at the center of the open field, was a child, alone, spinning slowly in place with arms out, laughing in the rain. She hadn't seen it yet, but the bear had seen her, and it was moving. From the edge of the village, boots pounded the mud. Shouts cracked through the air like gunfire. "Don't run! Call her back! Lina, get back here!" But the girl just turned, puzzled. Her mouth parted, her brows lifted, and then her eyes caught it. The figure not, a man, not a shadow, but something huge, something primal, soaking wet, snorting, barreling through the tall grass with shoulders that swayed like a wrecking ball. Her voice caught in her throat. She took one step back and stumbled. From the cage, Rocco let out a sound no one had heard from him before. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a growl. It was feral. An explosion from his ribs rupture. He hurled his body against the cage door. It held. He hurled again. A hinge snapped. Children watching from behind the coop screamed, and still Lena stood frozen paralyzed, small hands raised as if that would stop the 1,000-pound shadow that now charged like a freight train born of hunger and rain. The bear was 20 yards out. Then 15. Then 10. Her father was running. So was the trapper. And 2 neighbors with rusted pitchforks. But it was too far, too late. And then a blur of black and tan cut across the field. Fast, low, Rocco. No chain, no hesitation. Only speed. And teeth. And instinct. The wind howled like it remembered something terrible. Lena couldn't move her legs frozen in mud and fear. Eyes wide, lips trembling. The storm caught in her chest. The bear loomed above her now. A mountain of matted fur and muscle, heaving with rage and hunger, eyes black as the sky, rain slid down its flanks, steam curling from its breath. The world shrank to the space between the girl and the beast. And then from the side, a sound cracked through the chaos. Not thunder, not a man's yell, but a howl. One born of memory, of war, of pain long buried, and love freshly unearthed. Rocco. The cage had split behind him, twisted iron and splinters of old wood strewn across the ground like the wreckage of something that once held back a storm. The chain, thick and rusted, dragged from his neck like a forgotten shackle. But it no longer held him. He didn't pause, didn't bark, didn't flinch. He threw his body forward, head low, teeth bared, ears flattened against the wind as he leapt. The bear reared up. Too late. Rocco collided with it like fury made flesh. The sound was sickening bone on bone, claws in hide, jaws snapping. Lena screamed. So did the villagers. But Rocco didn't hear, didn't care. The bear swiped a brutal downward arc that would have crushed bone. Rocco ducked low, circled, bit deep into the creature's hind leg. The bear roared, spun, catching Rocco's side with a glancing blow that sent him sprawling. Blood splattered the wet grass. Lena crawled backward, eyes wide with horror. "Rocco," she whispered, voice cracking. He rose again, staggered, snarled. The chain trailed behind him like a flag of defiance. He lunged once more, aiming higher, this time sinking his teeth into the thick fur at the bear's neck. He held. The bear stood, trying to shake him loose. Rocco didn't let go, didn't yield, didn't break. The others had arrived nowhere, father. The trapper, a neighbor with a long pole. But they couldn't get close, could barely breathe through the violence. This was Rocco's fight. The storm raged on, drumming overhead like a war march. The bear, wounded and confused, twisted violently. Rocco fell, hit the ground with a thud, but even as blood oozed from his ribs, he staggered to shield Lena's body with his own. The bear hesitated, snorted, took a step back. Another. Then, with a snarl of frustration and a limp dragging from its hindquarters, it turned and disappeared into the trees, gone. Silence fell, except for the rain and the girl's whisper. "You saved me." Rocco collapsed. His legs buckled. His breathing came in ragged gasps. Blood seeped slowly from his side, mixing with the rain like ink in water. But he didn't cry out, didn't whine. Only looked Upai soft now at the girl he had chosen. The girl who had sung through storms, who had spoken to him like he mattered, who had never touched him but had reached deeper than any hand could. Lena dropped beside him in the wet grass, uncaring of mud or blood or cold. Her tiny fingers brushed his ear, his first real touch. He didn't flinch. "Rocco," she whispered, "it's okay. I'm here." He exhaled, shuddering, then closed his eyes. The chain lay in the grass beside them, broken, like the story that once defined him, but not the one that would define him now. Dawn didn't rise, it bled. The storm had passed, but the sky remained low and heavy, gray as regret. Mist curled like breath over the soaked field, swallowing shapes and sounds, until all that remained was the hush of a village that had seen too much and spoken too little. And in the center of it, like a story too raw to touch, lay the dog. Rocco. Still, broken, breathing, barely. Lena knelt beside him, her body curled around his like a second heartbeat. Her face was pale, lips chapped, hair soaked and plastered to her cheeks. She didn't cry, not anymore. She simply stared at his flank, at the blood that pooled beneath him, dark, sticky, staining the earth like truth that couldn't be taken back. Her hand rested on his fur now. That invisible line between wild and ours had been crossed in the night, and no one dared draw it back, not after what they saw. One by one, they came. Villagers, farmers, mothers in slippers, old men gripping canes, a toddler in her mother's arms, pointing with wide eyes at the big doggy who had fought the thunder thing in the trees. No one spoke. Not yet. They circled. A quiet ring of witnesses' shoes in mud, hearts and throats, some still trembling from the terror, others unsure if they were looking at a monster or a savior. Then came the boy, the same one who once dared to peek through the hedge, the one who had run back to tell the others that the monster wasn't growling but resting its head beside the girl. He was younger than Lena, round-faced, cheeks still smeared with dirt from the night before. In one hand, he held a wooden horse scratched, missing one ear, a toy carved by someone who loved him, passed down from older hands. He stepped forward, past the silent adults, past their stares, past their fear. Lena looked up. The boy said nothing. He just knelt slowly and placed the toy down beside Rocco's muzzle. Nodded him, beside him, as if to say, "I share this with you, because you are no longer stranger." Rocco didn't move, but his eyes opened, just barely. And when they landed on the horse-worn and gentle, smelling faintly of childhood and sawdust, this ear twitched. A breath escaped him, ragged, but real. Lena whispered, "He sees it." The boy nodded solemnly. He didn't smile. He just sat down cross-legged in the wet grass, waiting. Not for thanks, not for recognition, but as if keeping vigil beside a fallen knight. The villagers didn't stop him. They couldn't. Something had changed. Something old and brittle had cracked in the marrow of their silence. It wasn't just the blood in the grass. It wasn't even the roar that echoed through the trees, or the sight of fur slamming into fang. It was the way the girl stayed. The way the dog chose to fall between her and the beast. The way he didn't run. Her father stood behind her now. He didn't lift Lena, didn't scold or plead. He placed a coat over her shoulders. She didn't react, just kept her hand on Rocco's neck. Fingers curled softly. protectively like children do when they've learned that safety isn't always loud or strong. Sometimes, it's broken and breathing and bleeding beside you. The Vitold, nearly blind in one eye, finally stepped forward. He knelt beside the dog, ran a practiced hand over Rocco's ribs. No one dared speak. "Too broken," the vet murmured. "Maybe more inside. But lungs are clear if he makes the next hour." The silence thickened. "Then I can help," said another voice. A woman. Teacher. She stepped forward with clean rags. "I have herbs," said a man. "My barn is warm," said a third. The village shifted. Not with words, but with movement. A cot was brought. Arms reached. Rocco was lifted gently, slowly, as if he were carved from something fragile and sacred. Lena never let go of his paw. The boy followed, toy horse forgotten in the grass. Or maybe not forgotten, maybe gifted. The morning sun hesitated behind the clouds, as if unsure whether this village deserved warmth again. But something had already shifted in the bones of the valley. The air was no longer still. It listened. And then Marta stepped forward. She moved through the quiet crowd like someone stepping into memory. The iron key in her hand jingled 1C, sound too small to matter, too loud to ignore. She had been the one to lock the cage. Now she would open it. "Enough," she said. Not loudly, not angrily. Just a single word, tired and brave, cracking the silence that had held for too long. Her hand trembled, just once. As she reached the last gate, the padlock rusted from years of rain, of avoidance, of stories left untold. The metal clicked. A hush followed. Then the door creaked open on its hinges, and for the first time in his new life, Rocco was no longer behind bars. He didn't move right away. He was lying in the hay-strewn barn now, his body bandaged, flanks stitched, eyes glazed with pain but still aware. They'd carried him here hours ago. Lena had stayed the entire time, her fingers barely leaving his fur. When the last chain dropped, his head turned toward the sound. His ears twitched. His chest rose, then shuddered, and Marta knelt. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Not to the villagers. Not to Lena. Just to him. I was afraid of the wrong things." Lena didn't need words. She simply moved the blanketous blanketto the space beside her, where the hay was softest, where the sunlight finally dared to spill. Rocco's paw dragged forward slowly, 1 inch at a time, until it rested on the edge of it, like claiming a corner of trust. The chains weren't just metal, and they hadn't just held Rocco. They'd held the village, too. By noon, the barn doors stayed wide open. No one locked them again, and one by one, they came. A child with a slice of bread tucked in his pocket accidentally dropped near Rocco's nose. 2 girls pretending to look for kittens, sneaking glances at the dog with eyes wide from both fear and fascination. And adults more hesitant, but drawn. A baker with a scar down his arm, who hadn't spoken to Marta since her decision to keep the dog caged. A mother who once pulled her daughter away when they passed the house. Now they came without words, but with gestures. Fresh water, clean gauze. A quiet hand resting on Lena's shoulder as if to say, "We see it now." By sunset, someone brought soup. Not for Rocco, but for the people sitting around him, because they stayed. They sat in the straw and the dust, leaned against beams, spoke softly. Not about what had happened, but about who had changed. Lena leaned over, brushing a strand of hay from Rocco's face. He didn't flinch. "Do you want to hear the story again?" she whispered, cradling her sketchbook. "The one with the lighthouse and the dog who howled at ghosts?" His ear twitched. So she began. Her voice carried through the barn, low and warm, rising and falling like a tide. And as she spoke, Rocco rested his muzzle on the edge of her knee gently, tentatively. Children noticed, and they inched closer. One placed a small knitted glove beside his paw, whispering, "For winter." Another offered a single sugar cube. "My horse likes these. Maybe you do too." Marta stood outside, watching. She didn't step in. Not yet. Some forgiveness must be earned with silence. But her hand remained in her pocket, fingers wrapped around the empty lock. She would not throw it away. She would bury it. Later, quietly, beneath the maple by the well, Let the earth have it. Let the roots tangle with it. Let the tree grow around the rust. Inside the barn, Rocco closed his eyes. The world no longer smelled of steel and warning. It smelled like hay, like children, like old wood, like pencil shavings from Lena's sketchbook. And for the first time since memory dared return to him, he didn't dream of cages. He dreamed of open doors and of someone waiting on the other side. The town square wasn't a grand place, just cobblestones uneven with time and a crooked oak stump where announcements were made in summers long gone. But that evening, every lantern glowed like a hush being held. A folding chair creaked as someone shifted. Children sat cross-legged, chasing moths in the light beams. Elders leaned on canes, coats drawn tight. The barn stood open in the distance. A dark silhouette lay quiet inside. Rocco, someone had lit a candle just outside the doorway. Not for mourning, for witness. Because the village had changed, and they needed to say so. Marta stood with folded arms, glancing across faces she'd known her entire life. Bakers, seamstresses, farmers, teachers, people who once crossed streets to avoid a shadow. Now they crossed toward it, carrying scraps of bread and apologies unsaid. But tonight wasn't about them. It was about the girl who never asked for a stage and earned one anyway. Lena stood at the center. No podium, no script. Just a 12-year-old girl in a threadbare cardigan, her boots still muddy, her hands holding tight to the edges of her courage. At her feet, someone had placed the old blanket, Rocco's blanket. She stepped onto it like it was sacred ground, and then she spoke. "You all know me," she began, voice trembling like a string in the wind. "Or at least, you knew my silence." A breeze moved through the crowd. Some nodded. She looked down, took a breath, then lifted her chin not defiant, just steady. "You saw his growl," she said, voice growing clearer. "I saw his pain." Her eyes swept across the square, finding the faces that had once flinched. "And he saw me." A few murmurs rippled. Someone whispered, "She's right." Lena didn't stop. "I didn't ask you to trust him," she said. "Because trust isn't asked. It's earned." A pause. Her hands clenched the edges of her cardigan. "But not with leashes, not with bars, not with fear." Ems. Behind her, the barn door shifted in the wind. Light flickered. The candle still burned. Lena took another breath. "Rocco didn't protect me from the bear because he was trained. He did it because someone finally saw him as more than a warning." Her voice cracked, but she didn't falter. "He wasn't broken. He was waiting." Silence fell again, this time not out of awkwardness, but awe. Then the old vet stepped forward, the one who had whispered weeks ago, "Those scars aren't from fights." He removed his hat and held it to his chest. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About him, and about what pain can teach a soul." Marta moved beside him, her face drawn but open. "I locked him up," she said, no excuses. "I was scared of what he reminded me of, how much I'd stopped believing in second chances." Then came the grocer's wife, the boy who dropped the toy, the man who'd never spoken since his own dog disappeared years ago. One by one, they stepped forward, not with speeches, but with silence and stillness and presence. Lena looked down at her hands. She hadn't planned this. She didn't want applause. She just needed them to know. "There's a kind of kindness," she said softly, "that comes too late, and another kind that starts with listening." She touched her chest gently, where Rocco's muzzle had rested just the night before. "I think he heard it before any of you did." The bell above the chapel rang once unplanned. The hour had passed. A child nearby clapped. Others followed. Hesitantly. Then, louder. Lena flinched at first, but then she smiled. Not wide, not rehearsed, just honest. She stepped off the blanket, and a little boy ran to lay a flower there in her place. A daisy, crumpled, but brave. In the barn, Rocco stirred. His ear twitched at the sound of her voice, and though his body remained still, one paw reached forward, resting on the very edge of the light. Some wounds do not bleed, but they scream. The traveling vet's van pulled in just before noon, tires crackling over the gravel path, like a whisper that refused to stay buried. He stepped out with a quiet authority, not the kind that needed uniform or title, but the kind earned by holding the dying in your arms and naming their pain when no one else dared. He was a man in his 60s, lean, sun-weathered, with hands that never rushed and eyes that missed nothing. The children stopped playing when they saw him. Rocco had been moved to the back of the barn, laid gently on thick blankets, his body still aching from the fight, his breath shallow but steady. Someone had left a bowl of water, untouched, a knitted scarf, 2 Lenas. The vet knelt beside the dog without a word. No clipboard, no questions, just his hands. He ran them gently along Rocco's shoulders, his spine, the flank that Lena had noticed in the rain. And then he stopped. A long silence settled in the barn like dust. He pulled back a patch of matted fur, carefully parting it with fingers that had stitched war dogs and birthing goats alike. What lay beneath made him exhale sharply through his nose. A line, then another, cross-hatched, curved, raised, old scars, but not from barbed wire, not from fights. He leaned closer, ran his fingers along the pattern. Burns. Circular. Too precise to be accidental. Too cruel to be forgotten. From the doorway, Marta watched with folded arms, her face tightening with each slow discovery. Lena sat behind a bale of hay, hugging her knees, her knuckles white. She didn't look away once. The vet spoke low, more to himself than anyone. Whip marks, repeated, different stages of healing. Some years old. He pointed to a patch near Rocco's ribs. Herothermal trauma, branding maybe. Or a hot tool pressed in. He shifted, moved to the foreleg. Fracture. Old. Never set right. He limped because the bone learned to move around the pain. The vet's voice thinned, like the weight of the words hurt him more than speaking them. This dog didn't go mad, he said finally. He survived something that should have broken him. Marta stepped forward. Are you certain? He nodded once, then turned to face her fully. I've seen aggression. Trauma-induced, yes. But this is deliberate, systematic. His eyes softened. Someone did this to him. A hush fell over the barn. Rocco, who had been silent through it all, opened one eye, not in fear, but like he knew this truth had waited long enough. The vet met his gaze, and something in him faltered just slightly. He whispered, I'm sorry, old boy. Rocco didn't flinch. He simply blinked. Outside, a few villagers began to gather. Word had already traveled faster than wheels. Parents with children. Teenagers who once threw rocks. The baker, the trapper, the boy who dropped the toy. They didn't speak. They just waited. Back inside, the vet cleaned around the worst of the scars with warm saline and cotton. He didn't ask for help, but Lena came anyway, quietly holding the bandage roll. He looked at her gently. You've done well. He trusts you. Lena didn't speak, but when she held the gauze to Rocco's shoulder, the dog didn't move. Not a twitch. His side rose and fell with calm breath, like he'd been waiting for this moment. To finally be seen. Not as a threat, not as a weapon, but as someone who had survived. I don't think this started here, the vet said to Marta. Someone brought him from far. Maybe military, maybe not. But whoever left him, he trailed off. Lena looked up. They didn't leave him. The vet raised a brow. They discarded him. Rocco let out a soft sigh. The kind dogs make when they surrender not in defeat, but in relief. Marta stepped back and wiped a hand down her face. We locked up the wrong one, she murmured, and let the monsters walk free. Outside, the wind picked up. Leaves scattered like pages torn too late from a cruel chapter. That night, the village wouldn't sleep easily. Not because they feared Rocco anymore, but because they finally understood what he had endured. Evening pressed down on Elmridge as though the sky itself felt shame. The damp hush that followed the vet's verdict clung to every tiled roof and cracked window pane. Lanterns glowed, yet no one drew comfort from the light. One by one, the villagers drifted toward the square, called not by bell or decree, but by the heavy knowledge that no house could hold their thoughts tonight. Marta stood beneath the crooked oak, fingers locked around the padlock she had pocketed that morning. The metal was cold now, its weight absurdly small compared to what it once symbolized. Across from her, the baker shifted from foot to foot, flour still dusting his sleeves. The trapper leaned on his cane, eyes dark hollows beneath his hat brim. Couples arrived together, but kept small spaces between their shoulders. Children were absent, sent to bed so their innocence would not have to carry this burden. No speeches had been arranged, but words nonetheless began to surface sticky, hesitant, floating to fill the silence they had all helped create. I remember Jonas shouting at dusk, the grocer muttered, staring at his boots. He dragged Rocco by the collar if the dog lagged even a step. We heard it from our porch and shut the window. The schoolmaster swallowed. Once, on my way back from the river, I saw him strike the dog with the butt of a rifle. Rocco didn't even snarl, just cowered. I told myself it wasn't my concern. Marta's grip tightened until the padlock bit her palm. We all told ourselves that. Her voice was little more than a cracked reed. We crossed the street and called it caution, but it was easier than asking why a man needed a chain thicker than his own wrist. Rain began as a whisper, more mist than water, beating on wool coats and eyelashes. Yet no one sought cover. The confession was overdue. The penalty, a silence they would now have to live with. The trapper cleared his throat, the sound ragged. I called Rocco a beast to a child once, told him monsters deserve cages. I should have known better. Wild creatures fight to eat, to live. Only people teach cruelty for sport. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd like wind through drying corn. Guilt had many timbrures, brittle, barely spoken, but each note blended into the same low dirge. From the back, Lena's father stepped forward, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. The night Jonas disappeared, I heard Rocco barking long past midnight, he said, voice rough. I thought the dog had gone mad, so I hammered shut our shutters. If I'd listened closer, maybe I would have heard fear, not rage. Heads bowed. The wood of the stump where announcements were once nailed now served as an altar for their regret. Marta lifted her face to the pale glow of the street lamp. When Jonas vanished, we were relieved, not curious. A man who could beat a dog could do worse, yet we were content that the problem walked itself into the forest. We let the cage become truth. No one contradicted her. The only sound was rain sliding off eaves and the faint rustle of leaves on the oak. It felt as though the village had been holding its breath for years, and now exhaled sorrow into the cool night air. A soft step broke the stillness. Lena appeared at the edge of the crowd, hood pulled up, hands clasped. She did not climb the stump or raise her voice. She simply spoke into the hush that was already hers to command. He never attacked without warning, she said. Her words were gentle, yet unbearable. He cried out, and no one answered. So he used the only language left to him. The lantern light caught the fine bruise at her temple where panic had driven her to the mud the night before. No one could meet her gaze, though her eyes saw nothing. She continued. Pain changes the sound of a heartbeat. I heard it the first day I touched the cage. It was never anger-only pleading. A strangled sob slipped from a woman near the front. Lena turned toward it, nodding as though to grant permission for tears neither of them could see. We cannot rewrite those years, Lena said, but we can decide what his tomorrow feels like. She let out a breath, steady, yet trembling. No more cages. For him, or for anyone we're too afraid to understand. Oh? The traveling vet had stayed by the barn, tending Rocco, but now he approached, hat in hand. His body will heal, he told them quietly, if we choose to heal with him. Scars remind animals where the pain lived. Kindness can teach them where it no longer does. Marta stepped forward and placed the padlock at Lena's feet, rust flakes clinging to her palm. We'll bury this, she whispered, in earth that remembers everything and forgives only what we are brave enough to change. Oh. One by one, villagers nodded, some pressing hands to hearts, others wiping rain from cheeks that glistened far more than the drizzle could account for. They did not cheer. Guilt rarely ends in jubilation. But shoulders straightened as if a crooked spine had at last been set. The trapper removed his hat, letting the rain wash the sweat from its brim. Tomorrow, he said, voice firm, the fence comes down. We'll build no walls between us and what we fail to protect. A murmur of assent circled the square. Lanterns flickered, their flames bending but unextinguished. Lena listened to their promises, then turned toward the barn, where a low, weary whine drifted on the damp air. Rocco, sensing the quiet rattle of chains being broken in human hearts. She started back down the path, guided by that sound, her hands relaxed, her steps sure. Behind her, the villagers did not disperse immediately. They lingered beneath the oak, rain on their faces, letting the silence settle not as condemnation, but as the hush that comes after a prayer finally spoken aloud. Somewhere in the dark, the lock lay cold on the cobblestones, waiting for dawn and burial. Above it, voices mingled with falling rain soft, repentant, resolved. The village of Elmridge had awakened, and its first word was a vow born from the quietest sound of all, the heartbeat of a dog, steady and alive, echoing through their guilt until it became their guide. The path into the northern forest was narrower than Lena imagined, little more than a deer trail, half hidden beneath carpets of pine needles and last year's leaves. Damp morning light sifted through branches like dust in a cathedral, illuminating wisps of mist that clung to the undergrowth. Lena walked between her father and Dr. Castell, one hand on her father's arm, the other tracing air currents as if reading Braille in the breeze. They had set out at first light, following the trapper's directions. 30 minutes north, where the creek bends west, you'll see the remnants of Jonas's blind. The villagers had offered to come, but Lena insisted this piece of the story needed quiet witnesses, not crowds. Her father, Daniel, carried a spade across his shoulder. The vet held a canvas satchel filled with gauze and a single leather leash just in case. None of them spoke much. Words felt clumsy here, in a place where the forest hummed with things too old for language. They reached the clearing just after the sun slipped above the ridge. Jagged planks jutted from the ground, the broken skeleton of a hunting stand that once overlooked game trails but now sagged under moss and neglect. A rusted stovepipe leaned beside it, crushed by a fallen limb. Everything smelled of sap and distant rain. Daniel guided Lena forward. "We're here," he whispered. Lena released his arm and crouched, pressing her palm to the damp soil. She listened. No birdsong, only the faint chuckle of water where the creek sliced through rock a dozen yards away. The hush felt deliberate, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Dr. Castell stepped toward a patch of earth where weeds grew in an almost perfect rectangle. He knelt, brushing aside leaves. The soil looked disturbed once years ago, then forgotten. "A grave," he murmured. Daniel unslung the spade. "Jonas? Or something Jonas buried," the vet replied, voice thin. Lena stood beside them, hands clasped. "Dig," she said softly. Each shovelful released the scent of loam and rotting pine. Daniel worked methodically, sweat beading despite the cool air. The vet cleared loosened soil with gloved hands, careful, respectful. Lena knelt opposite them, trailing her fingers through displaced earth. Half a foot down, the spade struck metal with a dull clink. Daniel froze. Dr. Castell brushed more dirt away, revealing a tarnished buckle attached to a strip of cracked leather. He tugged gently, and an old collar came free-snapped clean at one end. Nameplate corroded but still legible. "Rocco, if found, return to Jonas Halberd." Lena touched the plate. Her thumb followed each letter like prayer beads. "He tried to keep the name," she whispered. The vet turned the collar over. Dried blood darkened one edge so old it looked like bark. "This broke under force," he said, voice tight. "Someone pulled it off." Beside the collar lay a small pile of objects. A spent rifle shell, bits of rope, and a rust-eaten chain link identical to those once welded to Rocco's cage. Daniel's jaw clenched. Jonas buried his mistakes, he muttered. A few inches deeper, the spade caught something softer than stone, yet firmer than soil. Carefully, the vet exposed a rotted burlap sack. Inside, splintered wood fragments, perhaps pieces of a gun stock and a handful of wolf claws strung on twine. Talismans Jonas used to brag about in the tavern. Evidence of cruelty masquerading as sport. But Nuhuman remains. Jonas had indeed vanished into the forest, leaving only echoes of violence. Lena held the collar against her chest. The metal was cold, but she felt warmth. Rocco's heartbeat transplanted into her palm. "This is where his story broke," she said. Dr. Castell nodded. "And where ours continues." Daniel rested the spade, shoulders heavy. "What do we tell the village?" "The truth," Lena answered. "That the monster wasn't the dog." Silence followed, not empty ripe, as though the trees were listening. A breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and a single shaft of sunlight pierced the canopy, falling onto the shallow grave. Dust motes danced, brief and bright. Lena straightened. "May I?" Her father stepped back. She knelt, clawing a small hollow in the dirt, and placed the collar there, faceplate up. Then she covered it gently, patting the soil flat. "For the earth to remember," she said. Dr. Castell removed the leash from his satchel. Its leather was supple, dyed a warm chestnut, nothing like the iron that had once bound Rocco. He set it atop the fresh mound. "For the life ahead," he whispered. Daniel bowed his head. "And for our shame," he added. Together they stood, hands clasped, the forest holding their silence. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called deep, resonant and everything stilled again. On the hike back, Lena walked unaided, her steps steady over roots and stones. She felt lighter, though tears traced quiet lines down her cheeks. Her father did not wipe them away. They were not tears of fear, but of knowing. At the edge of the village, church bells tolled noon. Children paused their games as the three figures emerged from the tree line. Adults looked up from stalls and doorways, questions poised on lips. Lena raised a hand just enough to halt the uncertainty. "We found what he buried," she said, voice carrying in the clear air. "And we left it with the pines. Let that be the last time the forest hides his cruelty." No one applauded. They didn't need to. Heads bowed, hands found each other's shoulders. The communal wound had been named. Now it could begin to close. Lena's final steps took her straight to the barn. Rocco lifted his head as she approached, eyes bright despite exhaustion. She knelt, pressing her forehead to his. "I carry your name," she whispered. "The forest does not." And Rocco exhaled a soft, grateful rumble from deep in his chest. His tail brushed the hay once, twice, as if sweeping away the last dust of chains. Outside, the village began to move slow, purposeful like people remembering how to build with both hands instead of hiding behind them. The path to healing had started, and every footprint that day pointed forward. The first light over Elmridge used to belong to roosters and rattling shutters. Now it began with the soft tread of paw pads on cobblestone. Rocco trotted a half-step behind Lena as she made her way down the lane toward the little brick schoolhouse. No leash guided him. No gate restrained him, only the quiet assurance of the girl whose cane tapped a gentle rhythm on the waking earth. He matched her tempo instinctively. 2 beats of the stick, 3 of his paws. A whispered pause while she oriented to a cross-street smell-fresh bread, lilac soap, wood smoke curling from a chimney. Villagers opened doors to sweep stoops or hang wash and found themselves pausing mid-gesture. The sight had not grown old. Each morning carried the thrill of something impossible made ordinary. "Good day, Rocco," called Mrs. Talbot, pressing a basket of rolls against her hip. The dog's ears flicked. He offered a single tail thump before resuming his post beside Lena. Old Mr. Harrow, once the first to warn of the beast, touched the brim of his cap. "Looking strong, friend." He slipped a strip of dried venison from his pocket. Rocco accepted it delicately jaw that once snapped in terror, now closing with the politeness of gratitude. Wordless rituals bloomed along the way. A nod from the blacksmith, the twins waving from their porch, the seamstress clicking her tongue to let Rocco know a scrap of fabric could be his if he cared to claim it later. Each greeting layered onto a new vocabulary, one built from names, not rumors. At the schoolyard gate, Lena stopped to listen. Children's voices rose and fell, like birds in the branches. Lessons recited, jokes traded, somebody's lunchbox clattering open too soon. Rocco sat at her heel while she folded her cane. His head reached her hip now that he held it high. The scar on his flank showed only as a pale line beneath fresh fur. A hush spilled across the yard as they stepped inside. Dozens of small faces turned no longer in fear, but in welcome, well-rehearsed. "Morning, Lena." "Morning, Rocco." He returned the chorus with a chuff so low it tickled dust from the ground. The children giggled, scattering back to chalkboards propped against stumps and benches beneath the oak. The Tachera, young woman with ink-stained fingers, met Lena near the steps. In her arms, she carried a stack of crayon drawings already smudged by proud hands. "We started a wall for him," she whispered, fanning the pages. Lena traced the top sheet, a shaky outline of a dog standing between a girl and a gigantic brown scribble labeled beer. Above the scene, block letters proclaimed, "Brave Rocco saved Lena." She smiled. "He'll like them." As if understanding, Rocco nosed the page, his breath stirring the waxy paper. Children squealed softly, thrilled that their hero had inspected their art. While lessons began arithmetic, drifting through open windows, Rocco settled beneath them, paws crossed, eyes half closed yet vigilant. He did not nap, he listened. to Lena's voice reciting fractions, to chalk tapping, to a bead that rolled off a desk and would have clattered onto stone if he hadn't stretched one paw to still it. The teacher nodded her thanks mid-sentence, and the class continued unbroken. During break, the children clustered around him, presenting more drawings. Rocco rescuing kittens, Rocco wearing a superhero cape, Rocco atop a mountain of discarded chains turned into playground swings. He regarded each masterpiece with solemn interest, offering the occasional gentle lick that left damp signatures on paper and shrieks of delighted protest. One boy, the youngest, freckled and usually shy, held back until the others dashed off for tag. He stepped forward, clutching a stub of charcoal and a blank scrap. "Could I trace your paw?" he asked. Lena knelt to translate the request with steady hands along Rocco's leg. The dog lifted his paw unprompted and placed it on the page. The boy's tongue poked from the corner of his mouth as he guided the charcoal around pads and claws, careful, reverent. When he finished, he shaded a small heart inside the outline and printed "Thank you" in crooked letters. He offered it to Rocco, who nosed the paper once before letting Lena tuck it into her satchel. When the bell rang to end lessons, the teacher invited Lena to read from her own journal. She stood at the front steps, Rocco beside her like night beside dusk, and opened to a page filled with raised markings only her fingertips could decipher. "Some people think bravery is teeth and growling," she read aloud, voice clear over rustling leaves. "But sometimes bravery is when your heart is louder than your pain, and you step forward anyway." The children listened, still as saplings. Rocco stepped forward, she concluded. "Now we step with him, huh?" Applause burst small palms smacking together, pencils clattering to the ground. Rocco's tail swept the dust again, and for a heartbeat his gaze lifted beyond the fence, toward the ridge where a forest breathed freely. Then he looked back at the children, at Lena, at the place that had become home. The walk back was sun-dappled and unhurried. Rocco paused at each doorstep that offered a greeting, accepted pats, declined pastries, save for one carrot from the gardener which he crunched with surprising delicacy. When they reached the cottage, he waited while Lena leaned her cane against the rail, then followed her onto the porch and laid at her feet with a contented groan. Her father emerged with 2 mugs of cocoa on warm, one cooled and poured into a shallow bowl. Rocco drank, then rested his head on Lena's slippers, eyes drifting shut. No locks clicked behind them. No bars separated love from fear. Morning had passed into afternoon without the clatter of chains, and evening would arrive the same. In a village that once mistook silence for safety, the brave dog's heartbeat now set the tempo. Feet matched it. Voices matched it. And somewhere in the clapboard schoolhouse, colored drawings fluttered on the walla gallery of second chances, signed by children who had learned that courage can wear fur and scars and still wag its tail at dawn. Spring crept into Elmridge like watercolor first, a faint wash of green on the hedgerows, then sudden splashes of yellow where dandelions dared the still chilly wind. On the south side of Lena's cottage, bare soil waited, a rectangle of earth that had grown only weeds and mislaid tools. Nadia, Lena's mother, stood on the porch steps one morning, trowel in hand, and decided the patch had waited long enough. She called it a sensory garden, though what she really meant was sanctuary. The plan took shape on scraps of butcher paper pinned to the kitchen wall, chamomile for soft scent, lambs, ear for velvet leaves, snapdragons because children like to make them talk, and a winding path of time whose fragrance would rise beneath bare feet. In one corner, she sketched a low bench in the shape of an open bookin' idea that made Lena laugh, imagining herself sitting inside a story while reading another aloud. Rocco watched each step of construction with mild curiosity. He padded behind Nadia as she marked borders with twine, nosed seed packets, and even on Sestoli a glove only to drop it by the wheelbarrow like an earnest foreman reminding her not to forget her tools. By the end of the first week, the soil was tilled, compost worked in, and a small white gate installed more symbol than barrier. Word of the project fluttered through the village, faster than seeds on wind. After classes let out, children arrived with mason jars of marigold starts, sunflower seedlings, even a tiny maple sapling someone's grandfather insisted needed ground that believes in second chances. They placed donations in Rocco's care, trusting the dog who now roamed freely but always returned by dusk, drawn to Lena's laughter like tide to moon. Saturday morning dawned gold. Nadia tied her hair back with twine and pressed a paper packet into Lena's palm. Lavender, she said. For calm, Lena knelt, pushed her fingers into the cool earth, and sprinkled the seeds in a curving row beside the bench. Rocco settled near her, tail sweeping soil into soft mounds as if helping to tuck the seeds to sleep. By mid-season, the garden had transformed. Delphinium spires nodded above clusters of mint. Nasturtium trailed from half barrels, and the thyme path released tiny clouds of scent each time someone stepped along it. Bees stitched slow zigzags between blossoms, while Rocco dozed in his favorite Spoda sun-warmed oval near the bench where the lamb's ear formed a silver cushion. From there he could see the lane, the school gate, and the window where Lena waved at sunset. Most afternoons, the bench filled with voices. Children brought picture books or school readers, easing onto the wood in pairs. They took turns tracing words while Rocco lay below, eyes half closed, ears flicking to every syllable. When sentences caught on tricky consonants, he lifted his head, and the reader giggled, correcting themselves as though the dog were their patient tutor. One shy girl, May, preferred whispering poems directly into Rocco's ear. He answered with a soft rumble, part purr, part sigh, that made her smile wider than any teacher's praise. Adults visited too. Marta arrived one evening carrying a single rose cutting. She knelt beside Lena, planting it near the gate. Someone once told me roses have thorns, so they remember to protect themselves, she murmured. But they still choose to bloom. She stroked Rocco's neck gingerly at first, then with steadier fingers, he leaned into the touch, forgiving written in the roll of his shoulders. Dr. Castell dropped by with a worn field guide to herbs, pointing out which leaves soothed bruises and which teas calmed nightmares. Nadia brewed the first harvest of chamomile and thyme. Steam curled into the twilight, while neighbors shared cups against the lingering chill of early spring. By lantern glow they spoke of the bear, of Jonas, of the noisy silence that had held them hostage for years. And they spoke of Rocco, whose slow blink under lamplight felt like an amen. One late afternoon, Lena returned from school trailing new stories. She sat on the bench, Rocco's head in her lap, book open but unread. Listen, she told him, brushing his ear. The wind sounds like water today. He huffed, as if to say he'd noticed. She closed the book, content instead with the rustle of leaves and children's laughter beyond the gate. Trust, she realized, wasn't always a grand act. Sometimes it was lying in sun, warm soil beside someone who knew your darkest nights and stayed anyway. As seasons pivoted toward summer, blooms thickened, and the garden's thyme path became a well-trodden ribbon connecting house to village. On market days, travelers paused at the gate, surprised to find a German shepherd lounging amid petals. When they reached to stroke his fur, village children issued gentle instructions. Slow. Let him smell you first. Lessons learned from Lena's quiet tutelage. Every newcomer left with dusty knees and a story of the brave dog who guarded books instead of barns. One morning, the teacher arrived with poster paper under her arm. She called the children to gather, set the sheet on the bench book, and asked them to draw what trust looks like. Crayons scratched vivid arcs, bright blossoms, Rocco's tail sweeping thyme, Lena's fingers, writing Braille along lamb's ear. In the center, they sketched a padlock buried beneath roots-green shoots rising from its rusted shell. The teacher tacked the finished poster inside the schoolhouse doorway. Parents paused before it, reading with their eyes, with their hearts. And Rocco? He continued to lie in the sun, amber gaze soft, breathing in lavender and laughter. Scars remained beneath his coat, pale evidence of nights no one could erase, yet each exhale left them further behind. Occasionally he rose, did a slow patrol of the fence line habit more than need, then returned to his patch of warmth, sighing as if hay were silk. On a cloudless afternoon, Lena sat cross-legged next to him, palm pressed to the earth. Everything grows, she whispered, even the broken parts. Rocco nudged a fallen petal toward her knees, silent agreement. The garden rustled. Bees hummed. Pages turned. And for anyone passing through Elmridge that day, trust smelled of thyme and sounded like children reading to a dog who once had nothing but chains. Now king of a kingdom, no larger than a cottage yard, yet infinite in the space it carved inside their hearts. Dusk came softly, stretching lilac shadows over Elmridge, until every rooftop looked dipped in watercolor. The sensory garden settled into its nighttime hush-time scent, deepening. snapdragon mouths closing like sleepy children. Fireflies blinked their first rehearsals between lambs' ear leaves. From the cottage window, a warm glow slipped across the grass, guiding Lena and Rocco to their favorite spot beneath the young maple whose roots now cradled the buried padlock. Lena carried no cane tonight. She'd walked the path so many times her feet had memorized each dip and pebble. In her arms, she cradled an old photo frame. It's wood-sanded, smooth, glass replaced with clear resin so it would never shatter. Rocco padded beside her, shoulder grazing her skirt, breath slow and even. The scars along his flank were pale now, lost beneath a thick coat that caught the fading light in russet glints. They reached the bench book and sat Lena first, then Rocco curling close, head on her lap. She placed the frame upright on the bench. Inside was a collage. Children's crayon drawings of the brave dog, a pressed lavender sprig, a tiny charcoal paw outline, and in the center a photograph the schoolteacher had taken. Lena's sightless eyes turned toward the camera. Rocco seated tall at her side, the blanket draped across both their shoulders like a shared story. At the bottom, in tidy script, the caption read, "Morning without chains." The scene around them mirrored the print. No bars, no Walsenley garden, sky, and the hush of a village breathing easier. Lena traced the resin surface with her fingertips. Though she couldn't see the image, she felt the shapes, the slight ridges where flowers met paper. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Rocco's ear twitched. In the distance, children laughed bedtime games of tag in the lane. A pair of teens strummed a guitar on a porch. Somewhere, Marta's kettle whistled through an open window. Ordinary sounds, untangled from fear. Lena smiled. "That's what peace sounds like." She bent forward, arms encircling Rocco's thick neck. He stilled, then pressed closer until her cheek met the warm ruff behind his ear. His heartbeat thudded against her collarbone steady, reassuring. "You're not a beast," she breathed, voice caught between prayer and promise. "You're my guardian." "Oh." The words folded into twilight like petals closing over dew. Rocco's tail brushed the bench slow, content. He turned his head, nudging the frame with his nose until it tilted against Lena's thigh. She laughed softly and straightened it. Fireflies drifted nearer, their lights reflecting in Rocco's eye-estony twin constellations. Lena sensed the flickers, felt them as pinpricks of warmth on her skin, and imagined stars descending just to bless this moment. A breeze stirred the maple leaves. Two drifted down, one landing on the dog's muzzle. He snorted, cross-eyed, until Lena removed it with gentle fingers. "Still fierce," she teased, "but only against foliage." Rocco responded with a small chuff, then settled his head once more. Breath, warmth, peace, 3 notes, repeating like the simplest lullaby. Behind them, Nadia stepped onto the porch. She saw the pair silhouetted against the indigo sky, the frame glowing faintly in Lena's lap, and she did not call them in. Instead, she leaned on the railing, folded arms over her heart, and listened to the night compose itself around the picture her family had become. Down the road, the chapel bell marked the hour 1 clear tone. Lights winked out house by house. Yet the garden kept its own soft radiance. Lanterns hung from shepherd hooks, fireflies weaving, moon rising. Lena stayed until darkness blurred edges, and only shapes remained: the curve of Rocco's back, the gentle slope of his ears, the frame's pale outline holding memories safe. Finally, she spoke once more, words almost lost in the cricket's hymn. "Thank you for finding me." If dogs could answer in language humans understood, Rocco might have said, "You found me first." Instead, he exhaled, a sigh that fluttered the pages of an open notebook left on the bench. Then he rolled just enough to rest his paw across Lena's footclame and comfort in one simple gesture. She felt the weight, placed her hand atop it. Together they watched the last blush fade from the horizon, until night belonged wholly to them and the quiet gardenia canvas painted with trust. No flash captured the scene. Yet anyone passing later would swear they saw a still life framed by lantern light, a girl, a dog, and silence sown with crickets, proof that some endings sound like beginnings, and some cages open into gardens. The padlock lay buried beneath the maple's roots. But in the hush of that evening, another lock holder, hidden in many hearts, clicked open for good. And across Elm Ridge, sleep came easier, carried on the beat of one scarred guardian's chest and the steady hum of a village finally at rest. In the quiet wake of Elm Ridge's long season of change, One truth lingers brighter than any lantern. Compassion rewrites destinies. Rocco's journey from chained beast to trusted guardian reminds us that animals reflect the love, patience, and respect we choose to offer them. German Shepherds, celebrated for loyalty and courage, are also mirrors. When we see beyond scars and labels, their devotion blooms into partnership that protects, heals, and teaches. Lena's courage shows that empathy is not sight, but insight, the willingness to listen to pain beneath the growl and answer it with gentleness. The village's renewal proves communities grow stronger when they defend the vulnerable, bury old fears, and tend gardens of second chances together. May Rocco's story nudge us to greet every creature with open hands, to speak for those who cannot, and to cultivate spaces where trust takes root. In doing so, we honor the simplest, strongest lesson of all. Love patient, persistent, and brave turns, cages into doorways, and strangers into family.